Long before almonds became a symbol of health and sweetness, their wild ancestors carried enough poison to kill. Somewhere in the ancient mountains of Asia, early humans discovered a rare tree whose seeds were different, mild, edible, and worth protecting. That single choice began a story of survival, domestication, empires, trade routes, medieval kitchens, and modern industrial orchards. Before we uncover how humanity transformed a toxic seed into one of the world's most valuable foods, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more forgotten histories and ancient mysteries. On a dry hillside somewhere between the eastern Mediterranean and the mountains of Western Asia, a small tree stands under a hard white sun. Its leaves are narrow, its bark is dark and cracked, and when spring arrives it covers itself in pale blossoms before most of the surrounding landscape has fully awakened. By late summer, the flowers have become hard green fruits. Their outer flesh dries and splits. Inside, each one waits a shell. And inside that shell rests a seed that looks almost exactly like something familiar. It resembles the almond found in kitchens, markets, bakeries, and sweet shops across the world. Yet this seed belongs to a very different plant. Its taste is sharply bitter, and that bitterness is not merely unpleasant. It is a warning, crushed and digested. The seed can release hydrogen cyanide, a poison capable of disrupting the body's ability to use oxygen. In sufficient quantity, it can kill. This is where the history of the almond truly begins. Not in an orchard, not in a pastry, and not in the careful rows of modern agriculture, but inside a poisonous seed on a wild tree. The almond that later becomes a symbol of hospitality, fertility, luxury, and abundance descends from ancestors that protect their kernels with chemistry. Before people can cultivate it, trade it, grind it into milk, or turn it into marzipan, they first have to survive it. The transformation from dangerous wild seed to dependable food is one of the quieter achievements of early agriculture, but it reveals something profound about the way humans change the natural world. People do not begin with a harmless crop. They begin with a plant that seems to resist being eaten. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, the almond belongs to the genus Prunus, the same broad family of plants that includes peaches, plums, cherries, and apricots. What people call the almond fruit is not technically a nut in the botanical sense. It is a drupe, a fruit built around a hardened inner layer. In a peach, the fleshy outer portion is eaten and the stone is discarded. In an almond, the outer flesh is thin and leathery, while the seed inside the shell becomes the prize. The valuable part is hidden beneath layers of protection, and in the wild form that hidden seed may contain enough toxic compounds to punish the animal or person who breaks through. The bitterness comes mainly from a compound called amygdalin. When plant tissue is damaged, enzymes can break amygdalin apart and produce several substances, including hydrogen cyanide. The exact amount varies from tree to tree and seed to seed. Not every bitter almond carries the same danger, and the line between an unpleasant dose and a dangerous one is not perfectly predictable. That uncertainty would have made wild almonds especially risky to early gatherers. A seed might be merely harsh. Another from a nearby tree might contain far more cyanogenic material. The evidence remains incomplete about exactly how prehistoric people first judged that danger, but what survives in the record suggests they were skilled observers of plants, seasons, flavors, and bodily effects. They lived in landscapes where a mistake could not be corrected by reading a label. For the wild almond, bitterness is a defense. Seeds represent stored energy and future reproduction, so plants benefit when those seeds are not simply consumed and destroyed. Cyanogenic compounds discourage many animals from eating the kernel. Humans, however, bring a different kind of pressure. They taste, compare, remember, carry, process, and return. Once people notice that some trees produce less bitter seeds, the plant's chemical defense begins to become a weakness. A mutation that may offer little advantage in the wild can become highly desirable near a human camp. At first, the landscape offers no obvious distinction between safety and poison. Sweet and bitter almond trees can look nearly identical. Their blossoms do not announce the chemistry of the seed. Their leaves provide no reliable warning. The shell conceals what matters. Only after cracking the fruit and tasting the kernel does the difference become clear, and tasting is itself the danger. It is easy to imagine generations of knowledge building around these trees. Certain groves may be remembered as safer, particular trees may be revisited, seeds from favoured trees may be carried home, stored, or dropped near settlements. None of this requires a theory of heredity, it requires attention. The toxic almond belongs to a wider human story, long before written medicine, chemical analysis, or genetics. People regularly encountered plants that could nourish, heal, sicken, or kill depending on species, dose, and preparation. Acorns may require leaching. Cassava must be processed to reduce cyanogenic compounds. Certain beans need thorough cooking. The boundary between food and poison is often not fixed. It can depend on knowledge. Almonds fit this pattern, but with an unusual twist. Instead of merely learning to process the dangerous form, humans eventually encourage a new form to dominate, one in which the warning taste and much of the toxic chemistry are greatly reduced. Even today, the old danger has not completely disappeared. Bitter almonds still exist, and closely related stone fruit kernels can also contain amygdalin. Commercial sweet almonds come from selected varieties in which the biochemical pathway producing strong bitterness is largely suppressed, yet an occasional bitter seed can still appear through cross-pollination, genetic variation, or unmanaged trees. Modern food systems usually remove or regulate such material. But the possibility is a reminder that domestication does not erase ancestry. It manages it. The smell of bitter almond has also entered cultural memory because hydrogen cyanide is often described as having an almond-like odour. The comparison is imperfect, and many people cannot detect the smell at all. Genetics influences whether a person can perceive it. This lesser-known detail gives the almond an eerie double identity. Its aroma can suggest sweets and celebration. Yet it is also associated with one of chemistry's most feared poisons. The same seed can sit at the edge of nourishment and danger. Scholars still debate exactly when people first recognized naturally sweet almonds and when repeated selection became true domestication. Charred shells survive in archaeological sites, but shells alone do not always reveal whether the kernels were sweet, bitter, gathered, processed, or cultivated. Some bitter almonds may have been eaten after roasting or other treatment, though no single explanation fully accounts for how consistently safe consumption began. The transition probably does not occur in one village or one dramatic moment. It unfolds gradually, through repeated choices made by people whose names are lost. That is the first mystery of the almond. A tree armed with poison becomes one of humanity's most widely loved foods because people notice the rare exception hidden among dangerous seeds. Somewhere in the ancient landscape, someone cracks open a shell, tastes a kernel, and discovers that it is not bitter. The moment leaves no inscription and no monument. Yet from that small difference, an entire agricultural history begins. The dangerous seed does not emerge from a gentle landscape. Wild almonds belong to regions where survival depends on endurance rather than abundance, across the dry mountains, rocky valleys, and open scrublands stretching through parts of Western and Central Asia. Their ancestors grow where winters can be cold, summers can be brutally dry, and rainfall arrives irregularly, sometimes in brief seasonal bursts that vanish almost as quickly as they come. The soil is often thin. Slopes shed water. Wind strip moisture from exposed branches. In such places, plants cannot afford waste. Every leaf, root, flower, and seed is shaped by the demand to survive long periods when the landscape appears almost empty. The almond tree answers this harshness with a collection of quiet adaptations. It is relatively small, often twisted by wind and poor soil, with roots capable of reaching into cracks where moisture lingers below the surface. Its narrow leaves reduce water loss. Its winter dormancy protects living tissue during cold months, while its early spring flowering allows reproduction to begin before the full heat of summer arrives. The blossoms are delicate in appearance, but their timing is a gamble. They may open while snow still clings to distant ridges and while frost remains possible at night. A sudden cold spell can destroy a season's flowers, leaving the tree alive but fruitless for another year. This early flowering habit later becomes one of the almond's most recognizable features, but in the wild it reflects the narrow window available between winter cold and summer drought. The tree must move quickly. It produces flowers before a heavy canopy of leaves develops, exposing pale petals clearly to insects searching for the first sources of nectar and pollen. If pollination succeeds, the fruit begins to form while spring moisture remains in the ground. By the time the hottest months arrive, the developing seed is protected inside its shell and leathery hull. Wild almonds are not represented by a single uniform species spread neatly across a map. They belong to a complex group of closely related trees and shrubs, many adapted to particular elevations, soils, and climatic zones. Some grow in the eastern Mediterranean. Others occur through Anatolia, the Caucasus, Iran, Afghanistan, and farther into Central Asia. Their ranges overlap, and they can sometimes hybridize. This makes the almond's earliest history difficult to reconstruct. The modern cultivated almond most likely descends primarily from wild populations in Southwest Asia, especially from species closely related to Prunus fensliana, but scholars still debate the precise contribution of different wild relatives. The evidence remains incomplete because plants do not leave family trees in stone. Their history must be rebuilt from living genetics, ancient remains, geography, and the scattered traces of human movement. During the late Ice Age and the warmer millennia that follow, these landscapes change repeatedly. Rainfall patterns shift, grasslands expand and contract, forest zones climb and retreat along mountain slopes. Human groups move through the same regions, following herds, collecting seasonal plants, and learning the character of valleys that may appear barren to an unfamiliar eye. Wild almond stands would not necessarily form vast forests. They often grow as scattered trees or dense thickets among pistachio, oak, juniper, and other drought-tolerant vegetation. Their pale spring blossoms may briefly reveal their presence across otherwise muted hillsides, but for most of the year they blend into the brown and grey terrain. For mobile foragers, such trees offer both opportunity and difficulty. Almond kernels contain fat, protein, and energy in a compact form. Their shells protect them from rapid decay, and once dried they can be carried or stored more easily than many soft fruits. Yet the reward is locked behind wood-like armour and guarded by bitterness. A person must collect the fruit, remove or wait for the hull to split, crack the shell, and judge the kernel inside. This is not effortless food. It requires tools, patience, and knowledge, all of which prehistoric communities possess in forms that archaeology can only partially recover. Stone anvils and hammerstones could break the shells, though the same tools were used for many other purposes. Fire may have altered flavour or reduced some harmful compounds, but the effectiveness of roasting bitter almonds varies, and it would not guarantee safety in every case. Soaking, grinding, or repeated washing may also reduce cyanogenic material, as similar methods do with other toxic plant foods. Scholars still debate how often wild bitter almonds were deliberately processed for consumption, and how often people simply selected naturally sweeter kernels. Both behaviours may have existed in different places and periods. The mountain environment itself encourages close observation. Wild resources are seasonal, and a productive tree can matter greatly in a poor year. People who return to the same valleys learn which springs hold water longest, which slopes warm first, and which plants fruit reliably after a cold winter. An almond tree producing unusually mild kernels would be memorable. It might become part of a mental map passed between generations, known not by written coordinates, but by a nearby rock face. A stream bed, a stand of oaks, or the shape of a ridge. The tree's natural method of reproduction also influences what happens next. Almond seeds do not produce perfect copies of the parent tree. A seedling carries a new genetic combination, so planting a sweet almond kernel does not always guarantee another tree with identical qualities, particularly when pollen comes from surrounding wild trees. This later makes grafting important, but long before grafting is widely practiced, human selection can still shift the odds. People gather from trees with desirable seeds. They transport those seeds. Some are eaten, while others are lost, discarded, cached, or intentionally planted. Over generations, the concentration of useful trees can increase around places where people live. Yet the wild landscape remains the first architect. Drought gives the almond its toughness. Cold creates its dormancy. Short springs shape its flowering. Poor soils favour a tree able to survive where more demanding crops struggle. The same environmental pressures that make the plant difficult also make it valuable. Once tamed, almonds can produce food on stony ground and dry hillsides that might not support fields of grain without great effort. There's another contradiction hidden in these mountains. The almond appears independent, almost austere, but its reproduction relies heavily on other living creatures. Most almond varieties cannot reliably fertilize themselves. Pollen must move between genetically compatible trees, usually carried by insects. In the wild, solitary bees and other early-season pollinators travel from flower to flower during a brief and uncertain spring. Wind, frost, rain, and insect activity all influence whether the branches later carry fruit. Long before humans organize orchards or transport bees across continents, the almond already exists within a delicate network of climate, geography, and animal behavior. The first human relationship with this tree therefore begins as an encounter with a landscape system rather than with a crop. The almond is one element among many in a rugged zone connecting continents and ecological regions. It grows along routes that humans repeatedly travel, between the Mediterranean coast and the interior plateaus, between fertile lowlands and high mountain passes. These are not empty margins. They are corridors of migration, exchange, refuge, and experimentation. Here, among dry slopes and unpredictable seasons, the wild almond acquires the qualities that later carry it across the world. It is compact, durable, energy-rich, and capable of surviving difficult ground. It is also variable. One tree may be deadly bitter, another merely unpleasant, and a rare one unexpectedly sweet. That variation is the opening humans need. The mountains create the plant, but human attention begins to separate one almond from another. Variation is the key to the almond's transformation, because wild almond trees do not all defend their seeds in exactly the same way. Across a single hillside, one tree may produce kernels so bitter that the taste is immediately alarming, while another may be less severe, and a rare tree may carry seeds with little bitterness at all. To an animal, this difference may be accidental. To a human gatherer, it is the beginning of selection. The dangerous ancestors of cultivated almonds contain the possibility of sweetness within their own genetic diversity, hidden among countless seeds that remain chemically protected. Bitterness in wild almonds is not a flaw, it is an effective survival strategy. The seed inside the shell contains concentrated energy intended to support a new plant during germination. If every animal that cracks the shell destroys the kernel, the tree loses its future offspring. Amygdalin and related compounds create a powerful deterrent. Their unpleasant taste encourages many animals to stop eating before consuming a dangerous quantity, while the toxic effects punish those that continue. The plant does not need to kill every predator. It only needs to make its seeds less attractive than other available foods. Yet plant defenses are never perfect. Rodents may carry almonds away and store them, occasionally forgetting buried seeds that later germinate. Birds may damage fruits without consuming the entire kernel. Insects may attack the hull or shell. Different animals vary in their tolerance for bitter compounds. The almond exists within an ongoing contest between protection and consumption, and that contest ensures that no defense remains completely secure. Humans enter this struggle with stone tools: fire, memory, and an unusual willingness to investigate foods that other animals reject. The chemical pathway behind bitterness is controlled by genes that influence whether certain compounds are produced and stored in the seed. In wild populations, the bitter form is generally favored because it protects reproduction. But mutations occur naturally. A change in a regulatory gene can interrupt the process, greatly reducing the amount of amygdalin reaching the kernel. The result is a sweet almond, or at least one that is mild enough to eat without the intense warning taste of its relatives. Such a mutation is useful to people but potentially disastrous for the tree in an untouched environment. A sweet kernel is easier for animals to consume. Its shell still offers protection, but once that barrier is broken, the seed has lost its chemical defense. Without human intervention, a sweet-seeded tree might leave fewer surviving descendants than bitter trees around it. Its mutation could remain rare or disappear entirely. Human preference reverses that disadvantage. People protect the vulnerable tree, gather from it repeatedly, and transport its seeds beyond the range where the mutation first appears. This reversal is one of the defining features of domestication. Traits that reduce survival in the wild can become highly successful under human care. Grain plants that hold onto their seeds are favored because they are easier to harvest, even though wild grasses benefit from scattering seed widely. Fruits become larger and sweeter, making them more attractive to people, but often more dependent on cultivation. Animals become more docile. sometimes losing defensive behaviours essential to wild survival. The sweet almond follows the same pattern. Its lack of bitterness is dangerous in nature but valuable in a human landscape. Early gatherers do not need to understand genes to recognise this difference. Taste is enough. A bitter kernel announces itself almost immediately. The sensation is sharp, lingering, and difficult to ignore. A sweet kernel feels like a discovery. It offers rich fat and protein without the warning. Once people know that such trees exist, they can begin to search for them deliberately. They may crack several almonds from the same branch, compare trees from different slopes, and remember which locations produce the safest harvest. The exact frequency of sweet mutations in ancient wild populations is unknown. Modern studies suggest that a small genetic change can have a large effect on bitterness, but the prehistoric distribution of that change cannot be reconstructed with certainty. Ancient shells usually preserve shape rather than flavour. A charred almond found in a settlement may have come from a sweet tree, a processed bitter tree, or a kernel selected after tasting. Scholars still debate how quickly sweet-seeded types spread, and whether domestication began independently in more than one area. What survives in the record suggests that people were collecting almonds thousands of years before fully developed orchards appeared. At sites across Southwest Asia and the Eastern Mediterranean, archaeologists have recovered almond remains from periods when communities still depended heavily on hunting and gathering. These finds show familiarity, but not necessarily domestication. Wild almonds could be harvested seasonally and carried back to camp. The more difficult question is when people stop accepting whatever the landscape provides and begin actively changing which trees reproduce. That change may begin almost invisibly. Imagine a group returning each year to a valley where several almond trees grow. Most produce bitter seeds. One produces mild kernels. The people collect heavily from that tree, perhaps leaving fewer seeds beneath it, but they also carry its almonds away. Some are stored, some fall along paths, some are discarded near shelters or water sources. A few may be deliberately pushed into soil. If even one grows, the sweet trait has moved into a new place. The process is uncertain because seedlings do not always resemble the parent. Almonds are often cross-pollinated, and pollen from bitter trees can contribute genetic material to seeds on a sweet tree. Depending on inheritance, some offspring may remain sweet while others return to bitterness. Early growers may therefore face disappointment. A tree planted from a pleasant kernel can take years to mature, only to produce bitter seeds. This delay makes almond selection especially demanding. Annual crops reveal success or failure within a season. A tree asks for patience. That patience may encourage another level of observation. People learn not only which trees are sweet, but which seedlings seem related to them, which flowering times produce reliable crops, and which locations protect blossoms from frost. Gradually, they begin to manage populations rather than isolated trees. Bitter seedlings may be removed, sweet ones may be spared from cutting or grazing, useful trees may receive water or protection from fire. Domestication is not necessarily a single act of planting. It can begin as a pattern of preference imposed on a wild grove. There is a strange irony in this early relationship. The bitter almond's warning helps humans identify the trait they wish to eliminate. Because the difference is so obvious, selection can be intense. A person does not need subtle measurements to distinguish a strongly bitter seed from a sweet one. The plant's chemical defense creates a clear dividing line. Even if that line varies between individuals, each harvest becomes a test. And every sweet kernel becomes evidence that the dangerous plant can be changed. The mutation that weakens bitterness does not remove all risk at once. Some kernels may remain slightly bitter. Processing traditions may continue alongside selection. Communities may roast, soak, crush, or mix almonds with other foods. Knowledge of safe trees and safe preparation probably develops together. No single explanation fully accounts for the transition, and different communities may follow different paths. Some may rely on naturally sweet varieties. Others may continue using bitter almonds in limited ways. The boundary between wild food and cultivated crop remains blurred for generations. But the direction is clear. Humans are no longer merely enduring the almond's poison. They are choosing against it. Each favoured tree represents a quiet decision about the future landscape. The bitter ancestors remain on the hillsides, chemically defended and adapted to life without human help. Beside camps and settlements, another almond begins to emerge less protected, more useful. and increasingly dependent on the people who recognize its sweetness. Once people begin to recognize sweet almonds, the relationship changes from accidental discovery to deliberate risk. Early gatherers do not approach the tree as modern consumers approach food. There are no cultivated rows, no standardized varieties, and no certainty that one kernel will resemble the next. Every collection contains a question. The shell must be broken, the seed exposed, and the taste judged. The first people who repeatedly gather almonds are not simply harvesting a resource. They are learning how to navigate a plant population in which nourishment and poison may grow side by side. This knowledge probably develops through experience shared across families and generations. A productive grove may be known for decades. Particular trees may be marked in memory by their position near a spring, a rock shelter, or a distinctive bend in a valley. Children may learn which fruits to avoid by watching adults sort the harvest. Kernels with a suspicious smell, colour, or bitterness may be discarded. The strongest warning remains taste, though tasting itself carries danger. A tiny bite can reveal bitterness before a full kernel is swallowed, allowing careful gatherers to reject the worst seeds. Such testing is imperfect, but it offers a practical method long before people understand the chemistry involved. The first use of almonds may therefore depend less on bravery than on discipline. A reckless person eating handfuls of unknown kernels risks severe poisoning. A cautious person cracks one, samples a small fragment, waits, and compares it with almonds from a known tree. Over time, this behavior produces a detailed local classification that leaves no written record. One tree gives sweet seeds, another gives kernels that can be eaten only after treatment, a third is never touched. The landscape becomes divided into remembered zones of safety and danger. Processing may have widened the range of almonds humans could use. Crushing exposes more plant tissue and can release cyanide-producing compounds, but it can also make repeated washing possible. Soaking ground or broken kernels may remove some soluble chemicals. Heating can reduce part of the danger, though bitter almonds are not made reliably safe by simple roasting alone. The effectiveness depends on temperature, preparation, and the concentration within each seed. Scholars still debate which techniques were used earliest because archaeological remains rarely preserve a recipe. A hearth containing charred shells proves that almonds were present near fire, but not exactly how they were prepared, or whether the kernels were bitter. Early communities were already experienced with troublesome foods. Across different regions, humans learned to leach tannins from acorns, cook toxic legumes, remove irritating plant tissues, and distinguish edible roots from nearly identical poisonous ones. This knowledge was essential technology. It did not produce monumental ruins, but it allowed people to convert difficult landscapes into reliable sources of food. The almond fits naturally into this tradition of culinary experimentation, where the kitchen begins not with taste but with detoxification. Its nutritional value makes the effort worthwhile. Almond kernels provide dense energy in the form of oils, along with protein and useful minerals. For communities living through seasonal shortages, a food that can be dried and stored has importance far beyond its size. Fresh fruits disappear quickly, leafy plants wilt, meat can spoil without careful preservation. Almonds sealed within hard shells remain protected from moisture loss and many forms of damage. They can be gathered in one season and eaten months later, carried during migration, or kept against a winter when other resources fail. The shell itself becomes part of the almond's value. It is inconvenient during eating, but excellent for storage. Uncracked almonds resist decay better than exposed kernels, and their compact form makes them suitable for transport. A family moving between seasonal camps can carry a supply without the weight and fragility of many other foods. This portability may help explain why almonds begin appearing far from the trees that produced them. A shell found at an archaeological site does not always mean the plant grew nearby. It may have arrived through travel or exchange. This creates another difficulty for modern researchers. Almond remains can reveal human interest, but they do not easily reveal the exact nature of that interest. A few shells may represent occasional gathering. Larger concentrations may indicate storage or processing. Repeated finds across centuries may suggest sustained use. Yet the transition from wild collection to management is rarely marked by a sudden change. Almond shells do not become dramatically larger at the moment of domestication, and sweetness cannot be seen directly in most ancient remains. The evidence remains incomplete, leaving researchers to combine botanical clues with settlement patterns and the broader history of early farming. Before formal cultivation, people may already be altering wild almond populations. They clear vegetation around favoured trees, making collection easier. They break competing shrubs for firewood. They protect certain groves from grazing animals. They burn parts of the landscape, accidentally or intentionally changing which plants return. They discard sweet seeds near camps. Each action shifts the local ecology slightly. A wild tree growing in a human-used landscape is no longer entirely wild in the old sense, even if no one has planted it in a straight line. The decision to plant an almond seed is a greater commitment. Unlike grain, which can produce a harvest within months, an almond tree may take several years before giving meaningful fruit. Whoever plants it is investing in a future season and perhaps in a future generation. The planter may move away before the tree matures. The community may return later. A child may harvest what an older relative placed in the soil years before. Tree cultivation creates a different relationship with place because it rewards continuity. Yet the outcome remains uncertain. A seed taken from a sweet tree does not guarantee a sweet offspring. Almonds reproduce sexually, and pollen from surrounding trees contributes half the seedling's genetic inheritance. A promising young tree can grow for years and eventually reveal bitter kernels. For early cultivators, this must have been deeply frustrating. They could select the sweetest seed they had ever tasted and still produce a useless or dangerous tree. The problem cannot be solved quickly, and no single explanation fully accounts for how ancient communities maintained desirable traits before advanced propagation methods became common. They may have planted many seeds and removed the bitter trees once they fruited. This is slow but effective when repeated over generations. They may also have noticed seedlings growing beneath or near reliable sweet trees and protected those more carefully. The most successful communities would gradually increase the proportion of edible almonds around their settlements, even if failures remained common. Selection works through accumulation, not perfection. The risk involved is easy to underestimate from the safety of the modern kitchen. For the first gatherers, an almond is not automatically food. It is a test of memory, preparation, and judgment. A mistake may bring dizziness, weakness, vomiting, difficulty breathing, or worse. The number of kernels needed to cause severe harm varies, and prehistoric people could not know the dose with precision. What they could know was that bitterness mattered, that some trees were safer, and the careful handling reduced danger. This makes the earliest almond gatherers active participants in an experiment stretching across centuries. They taste the variation nature provides. They preserve the rare, sweet forms. They carry seeds beyond their original groves. They wait years to discover whether a new tree has inherited the desired trait. Most of their decisions vanish without trace, but together they begin to force the almond across a biological boundary. The plant remains rooted in the wild hills, yet its future is increasingly determined around human fires. The transformation from dangerous wild seed to dependable crop does not require ancient farmers to understand heredity. It requires them to notice patterns and repeat useful choices. A tree producing mild kernels is spared. Its seeds are carried. Bitter offspring are cut down, ignored, or used only for fuel. Sweet trees receive attention, protection, and space. Over generations, this simple cycle begins to reshape the almond population. What looks from the modern perspective like plant breeding may have felt to early cultivators like patience guided by memory. Domestication is often imagined as a dramatic moment when humans seize control of a wild species, but the almond resists that kind of clean beginning. There is probably no single year when it stops being wild and becomes cultivated. For a long time, gathered trees, protected trees, planted seedlings, and truly managed orchards may exist together. People continue collecting almonds from natural stands even as they encourage useful trees near settlements. A sweet almond can still grow in a wild valley, while a bitter one may appear within a human-planted grove. The boundary remains uncertain because biology does not change according to the categories later historians create. The earliest growers work with a difficult crop. Almond seedlings vary widely. One may mature early, another late. One may withstand frost, while another loses every blossom to a cold spring. Some produce thin shells that are easy to crack but vulnerable to insects. Others form thick shells that protect the kernel but demand greater effort. yield, flavor, oil content, disease resistance, and tree shape all differ. Sweetness is the essential trait, but it is not the only one people eventually favor. At first, selection is probably severe and practical. A tree producing strongly bitter almonds has little value as food and may be removed. A tree producing edible seeds is retained even if its crop is small. Once the proportion of sweet trees rises, growers can begin choosing between safer varieties. They can prefer trees with larger kernels, more reliable harvests, or shells that split cleanly from the outer hull. The plant is not merely detoxified. It is gradually adapted to human labor, storage, cooking, and taste. This process takes time because tree crops operate on a slower rhythm than grain. Wheat and barley can be planted, harvested, and selected again within a single year. An almond tree may require several years before its qualities become visible. A generation of farmers can make only a limited number of selection cycles. Mistakes remain in the landscape for years. A bitter tree may consume water and space through several seasons before revealing that its seeds are unusable. Domestication, therefore, depends on long-term knowledge extending beyond the experience of one person. Oral memory becomes part of cultivation. Families remember which trees were planted from which kernels, which slopes produce the best harvest, and where late frost settles. A tree may acquire value because an earlier generation recognized its reliability. These living landmarks help tie communities to particular places. Unlike a seasonal field, an orchard survives across decades. Its branches carry the consequences of decisions made by people who may no longer be alive. The almond also forces growers to confront reproduction. Most almond trees benefit from pollen carried from another compatible tree. If only one desirable tree stands near a settlement, it may flower beautifully but produce little fruit. Several trees must bloom at overlapping times, and insects must move between them. Ancient farmers may not understand pollination in modern biological terms, but repeated observation reveals practical truths. Trees planted alone perform poorly. Groves give better harvests. Cold, rain, and strong winds during flowering can ruin the crop even when the trees appear healthy. Such knowledge encourages intentional placement. Almonds are planted where early sun warms the blossoms, where water drains rather than pools around roots, and where slopes reduce the danger of stagnant frost. They may be positioned near other flowering plants that attract insects. Walls, rocks, and natural folds in the land offer shelter. Domestication is therefore not only a change in the seed, it is also a change in the landscape around the tree. One of the most important later advances is vegetative propagation, especially grafting. Instead of planting a seed and waiting years to discover the result, a grower can take a cutting or bud from a proven sweet tree and attach it to a compatible rootstock. The new growth preserves the desirable tree's genetic identity. A reliable almond can be copied rather than recreated through uncertain sexual reproduction. The exact date when systematic almond grafting begins is difficult to establish, and scholars still debate how early specific techniques were applied to particular fruit trees. Yet once such methods become established, they transform cultivation. Grafting allows a grower to combine qualities from two plants. The upper portion may produce excellent kernels, while the rootstock may tolerate poor soil, drought, or local disease. Damaged trees can be renewed. Productive varieties can spread across regions without losing the traits that made them valuable. The long gamble of growing every almond from seed is reduced, though not entirely eliminated. Seedlings remain useful for creating new variation and supplying rootstock. But known varieties can now persist for centuries through repeated human copying. Before widespread grafting, another form of selection may already be shaping the crop. Almond trees capable of growing near villages endure conditions different from those of remote wild groves. They face pruning, smoke, grazing animals, compacted soil, and occasional watering. Trees that respond well to human disturbance leave more useful descendants. Cultivation unintentionally selects for tolerance of human environments, as well as for edible kernels. The almond begins to lose something as it gains human protection. Sweet seeds are more vulnerable to animals once the shell is opened. Productive branches may break under heavy crops. Trees selected for large kernels may invest energy differently from their wild relatives. In an unmanaged landscape, some cultivated traits offer little benefit. Near people, however, weakness can be compensated for. Humans drive away pests, clear competing vegetation, carry water, and plant new trees. The crop enters a partnership in which its success increasingly depends on continued care. This dependence is never complete. Almond trees remain hardy. Abandoned specimens can survive for years, and cultivated forms may cross with bitter relatives. Old orchards can become tangled groves where the distinction between wild and domestic blurs again. Seeds travel through animals and human discard. The domesticated almond is not sealed away from nature. It remains part of a changing population, constantly exposed to pollen, climate, and chance. What survives in the record suggests that this transformation happens across a broad cultural landscape, rather than within one isolated experiment. Communities exchange seeds, techniques, and knowledge. A sweet variety found in one valley may spread through marriage networks, seasonal travel, or trade. People do not need to carry many almonds to change another region. A handful of viable seeds, or later a few grafting materials, can establish an entirely new population. The most remarkable part of this process is its invisibility. There is no surviving inventor of the edible almond. No ruler claims responsibility for removing its bitterness. The achievement belongs to countless unnamed people who compare harvests, wait through unproductive years, and choose which trees deserve another season. They work without knowing that a regulatory gene controls the crucial chemical pathway. They simply understand that sweetness can be inherited often enough to pursue. By repeating that pursuit, they alter the future of the species. The poisonous wild almond remains in the mountains, but beside it grows a new plant shaped by human preference. Its seed is no longer primarily defended against consumption. It is designed, through selection, to be consumed. A mutation that once endangered the tree becomes the foundation of its worldwide success. The almond's transformation leaves no single dramatic artifact behind. There is no ancient tablet announcing the first successful orchard, no tool designed only for cracking its shells, and no preserved fruit whose sweetness can be tasted thousands of years later. Instead, the evidence lies in fragments, blackened shells from hearths, kernels reduced to carbon, storage pits containing mixed plant foods, pollen trapped in sediments, and the changing distribution of trees across landscapes increasingly shaped by human settlement. Each clue is small, and none is sufficient alone. Together, they reveal a long transition from gathering whatever the hills provided to managing and eventually cultivating particular trees. Almond shells preserve better than soft fruit because their hard structure can survive burning. In many ancient settlements, plant remains become archaeologically visible only after accidental charring. Seeds dropped into a fire, shells swept into a hearth, or stored food burned during the destruction of a building may be transformed into brittle carbon. The heat destroys much of the original material but can preserve its shape for millennia. Archaeobotanists recover these remains by washing excavated soil through water. Light fragments float to the surface, where they can be collected, dried, and examined under magnification. A small piece of shell that once looked like ordinary ash may become evidence of an ancient meal. At sites across the Levant, Anatolia, the Zagros region, and the eastern Mediterranean, almond remains appear among the debris of communities living through the great transition from mobile foraging to settled farming. Some finds come from periods before domesticated crops dominate local diets. These early shells indicate that wild almonds were already familiar resources. People gathered them, carried them to camps, cracked them, and probably stored at least some portion of the harvest. The presence of almonds alongside pistachios, acorns, wild cereals, legumes, and other plant foods shows that early communities relied on broad ecological knowledge rather than on a narrow agricultural menu. Yet presence alone does not prove cultivation. A settlement may contain almonds gathered many kilometers away. Travelers can carry them easily, and their shells protect the kernels during transport. A large collection might represent one unusually successful expedition rather than a local orchard. Even repeated finds over several generations may show only that people returned regularly to wild groves. This is one of the central problems in studying tree domestication. Grain crops often change visibly under selection. Their seed heads may become less likely to shatter, and their grains may increase in size. Almond shells offer fewer clear signs. While the most important domestication trait, sweetness, usually leaves no visible mark. Researchers therefore look for patterns beyond individual shells. If almond remains increase as settlements become more permanent, this may suggest intensified use. If they appear in regions where wild almond species are unlikely to have grown naturally, human transport becomes a stronger possibility. If pollen evidence indicates the expansion of almond-like trees near villages, management may be involved. If almonds occur alongside other cultivated fruit trees, storage facilities, irrigation features, or long-lived architecture, the broader context may support an interpretation of deliberate planting. Even then, caution is necessary. Pollen from different members of the rose family can be difficult to distinguish, and ancient climate zones do not perfectly match modern ones. A tree growing outside its expected range may reflect a past environment rather than human introduction. Shell size can vary because of species, soil, rainfall, and preservation. Scholars still debate how much confidence should be placed in any single measurement. The evidence remains incomplete because domestication is a behavioral process, while archaeology usually preserves physical consequences rather than intentions. The earliest settled communities may have begun by protecting existing almond stands rather than planting formal orchards. A grove close to a village could be cleared of competing shrubs. Grazing animals might be kept away during flowering or fruit development. Productive branches could be pruned, and favoured trees might receive water during extreme drought. These actions leave few direct traces. A managed wild grove can look archaeologically similar to an unmanaged one, especially after thousands of years of erosion, rebuilding, and changing land use. Settlement itself can encourage almonds to spread. People discard shells and uneaten seeds around houses, refuse areas, pathways, and seasonal camps. Most discarded kernels are eaten or damaged, but some remain viable. Seeds carried from a sweet tree may germinate near human activity, where they receive reduced competition and occasional watering. Over time, useful trees appear closer to habitation. The people who benefit from them may protect them without remembering who first carried the seed. The location of ancient settlements makes such developments plausible. Many early villages in Southwest Asia stand near ecological boundaries, where woodland, open grassland, river valleys, and mountain slopes meet. These zones offer a wide range of resources within a manageable distance. Almonds growing on drier hills can be collected while cereals and legumes are harvested from lower ground. As communities become more sedentary, the cost of travelling to distant groves increases. Bringing useful trees closer to the settlement becomes an efficient solution, even if the first planting is informal. Charred almond remains also reveal something about storage. Shell fragments found in concentrated deposits may represent harvests gathered in bulk. Whole almonds can be kept in their shells for extended periods, protecting the oily kernel from rapid deterioration. A stored supply provides food beyond the fruiting season and may serve as a reserve during crop failure. When archaeologists find almonds in buildings associated with storage, the nut appears not merely as a seasonal treat but as part of planned subsistence. Fire sometimes preserves the moment that planning fails. A house burns, a storage room collapses, and the year's supplies are trapped beneath mud, brick, and ash. Thousands of years later, the destruction becomes an archive. Among grains, lentils, peas, and dried fruits, almond shells show how communities balanced annual crops with tree foods. The lesser-known importance of these mixed stores is that they spread risk. Grain may fail under one pattern of weather, while deep-rooted trees survive. Almond blossoms are vulnerable to spring frost, but established trees can endure summer drought better than shallow-rooted field crops. A household using both depends on more than one seasonal cycle. Still, the shift from collection to cultivation cannot be dated to a single excavation layer. The process probably differs from valley to valley. Some communities may plant almonds early, while others continue harvesting wild stands for centuries. Sweet types may spread through exchange before orchards become common. A settlement can consume cultivated almonds without growing them locally if trade networks connect it to a producing region. No single explanation fully accounts for every archaeological find. The shells nevertheless record an unmistakable increase in intimacy. At first, almonds arrive as one resource among many gathered from a broad landscape. Later, they appear within communities whose houses, fields, storage systems, and long-term occupation reveal a commitment to place. The tree begins to fit this new rhythm. It rewards people who remain nearby long enough to protect a sapling, wait for flowering, and remember which mature trees produce the safest kernels. The decisive evidence is not one unusually large shell or one ancient grove, it is the convergence of repeated use, expanding distribution, settled life, and increasingly controlled plant economies. The archaeological record does not show the exact hand that plants the first sweet almond near a house. It shows the world in which such an act becomes useful, repeatable, and eventually ordinary. From scattered carbonized fragments, a larger story emerges. The almond is no longer simply being found. It is being drawn into the human landscape. As villages become towns and farming communities grow into organized states, the almond gains a new place in human life. It is no longer only a difficult wild food gathered from dry hillsides or a promising tree protected beside a settlement. It becomes part of a cultivated landscape planned years in advance. Fields of grain still provide the foundation of daily survival, but orchards add something different. They offer food that returns season after season from the same roots. Food that can be stored, carried, exchanged, and transformed into many forms without losing its value. Among the trees entering this new agricultural world, the almond is especially well suited to regions where heat, drought, and stony ground limit what farmers can grow. An orchard requires confidence in the future. Grain can be sown after rain and harvested within the year, but an almond tree asks a community to invest labour without immediate reward. Saplings must be planted, protected from animals, and sometimes watered through their first dry seasons. Several years may pass before a useful crop appears. During that time, political instability, warfare, disease, or drought can force people from the land. To plant trees is therefore to assume that someone will remain long enough to harvest them. Orchards become signs of permanence, not because every settlement survives, but because their creation depends on a belief that it will. Early civilizations developed the organization needed to support such long-term cultivation. Irrigation channels direct water toward fields and gardens. Property boundaries become more formal. Households, temples, estates, and palaces control land through systems that vary from region to region. Agricultural labor is scheduled around planting, harvest, pruning, storage, and tax collection. Almond trees fit into these systems because they can occupy slopes, field margins, and dry zones less suitable for demanding annual crops. They do not replace cereals. They expand the amount of nourishment that can be drawn from the landscape. The tree's deep roots allow an established almond to survive conditions that would quickly destroy young grain. This does not mean the tree produces well without water. Severe drought can reduce yield, weaken branches, and damage developing kernels. Yet the almond can endure long dry summers once its roots are established, especially in climates where most rain falls during winter. The same seasonal pattern that shaped its wild ancestors makes it useful to farmers across Southwest Asia and the Mediterranean. It flowers early, develops fruit through spring, and reaches maturity as the landscape dries. That early flowering remains dangerous. A late frost can erase the entire harvest while leaving the tree standing. Heavy rain can keep pollinating insects from moving between blossoms. A warm spell may encourage flowers to open too soon, only for cold weather to return. Farmers cannot control these forces, but they learn to reduce risk. They plant on slopes where cold air drains downward. They select varieties that flower at slightly different times. They preserve multiple trees rather than depending on one. What survives in later agricultural practice suggests that generations of observation refine orchard placement long before written manuals describe it. The harvest itself demands careful timing. As summer advances, the green outer hull dries, splits, and begins to pull away from the shell. Families can shake branches, strike them with poles, or gather fallen fruits from the ground. The almonds must then be dried to prevent mold and spoilage. Hulls are removed, shells are sorted, and damaged kernels are separated. In a productive orchard, this work involves more than a household afternoon. It becomes a seasonal labor requiring baskets, mats, storage containers, and coordinated hands. Once dried, almonds offer one of their greatest advantages: concentrated nourishment that occupies little space. Their oils provide dense energy, while their protein adds value to diets often dominated by cereals. A small quantity can support travelers, workers, soldiers, or herders moving far from kitchens and fresh supplies. Unlike ripe figs, grapes, or soft orchard fruits, Almonds do not bruise easily while still in the shell. They can remain edible through winter and sometimes beyond, provided they are protected from moisture, insects, and rodents. This durability makes almonds valuable during uncertainty. A poor grain harvest can threaten an entire community because bread and porridge depend on stored cereals. Tree crops cannot eliminate that danger, but they diversify the food supply. Almonds mature according to a different schedule and draw water from deeper soil layers. In some years, fields fail while established trees still yield something. In other years, spring frost destroys the almonds while grain survives. A mixed agricultural system spreads risk across species, seasons, and parts of the landscape. The shells also make almond stores easier to monitor. Whole nuts can be counted, measured by volume, divided between households, or set aside for future planting. Their compactness allows them to be placed in jars, baskets, sacks, or plastered storage rooms. Archaeological evidence rarely reveals exactly who controlled a particular supply. But in early states, durable foods often attract administrative attention. Grain, oil, wine, dried fruit, and nuts can be gathered as rent, tribute. Temple offerings, or tax. Almonds may not rival cereals in total volume, yet their high value and portability make them suitable for elite stores and ceremonial use. The crop also creates secondary materials. Almond hulls can feed animals in some circumstances, though their value varies and bitter material requires caution. Shells can be burned as fuel, especially in regions where wood is scarce. Pruned branches provide kindling or small timber. The tree casts limited shade compared with larger orchard species, allowing other plants or grazing animals to use the ground beneath it under carefully managed conditions. A single orchard can therefore contribute food, fuel, fodder, and useful space. Within growing towns, almonds begin to move beyond direct consumption. Kernels can be crushed into pastes, mixed with honey, added to breads, or pressed for oil. Their mild flavor allows them to enter both everyday foods and expensive preparations. The distinction between ordinary and elite use depends on local abundance. Near productive orchards, almonds may be familiar household food. Farther away, where every kernel must be transported, they become more costly. This uneven value encourages cultivation in suitable districts and demand in places where the tree performs poorly. The almond also gains symbolic importance because its biological rhythm is so visible. Its blossoms appear early, sometimes before winter seems fully gone, making the tree an image of renewal and fragile abundance. A branch covered in flowers promises a harvest, yet one cold night can end that promise. Communities living closely with orchards understand both meanings. The tree represents fertility, but never certainty. Its beauty is tied to risk. Scholars still debate how extensive the earliest true almond orchards were and how they were organized. Later texts and agricultural traditions describe deliberate cultivation, but the first stages must be inferred from plant remains, settlement patterns, and the spread of sweet varieties. The evidence remains incomplete, and small groves may have existed long before they became visible in written records. It is also difficult to distinguish household gardens from larger managed estates, when physical traces have been erased by later farming. No single explanation fully accounts for the almond's rise, but several advantages reinforce one another. It thrives in a climate familiar to early Southwest Asian and Mediterranean farmers. Its kernels store well. Its trees occupy land unsuitable for intensive grain cultivation. Its harvest can supplement diets, survive transport, and retain value across seasons. Most importantly, once a sweet and productive tree is established, it can continue feeding people for decades. The orchard therefore changes the scale of the human-almond relationship. A favoured wild tree once serves a small group who remembers where it grows. A cultivated grove can support households, institutions, and markets year after year. The almond becomes part of the planned economy of civilization, rooted in the soil but increasingly connected to systems of labour, ownership, storage, and power. Its poison has not vanished from the species, but within the orchard, sweetness is no longer a rare accident. It is becoming an expectation. Once almonds become reliable orchard crops, they begin to travel far beyond the dry hills where their wild ancestors first evolved. Their movement does not happen through one empire, one migration, or one trade route. It unfolds across thousands of years as merchants load sacks onto donkeys, Sailors carry provisions aboard coastal vessels. Farmers relocate with seeds in their belongings, and rulers transfer useful plants into newly controlled territories. The almond spreads because it is both alive and portable. A handful of kernels can feed a traveller, while a handful of viable seeds can establish trees in another valley. The eastern Mediterranean becomes one of the earliest great corridors of this expansion. Coastal settlements connect inland orchards to ports where goods move between Anatolia, the Levant, Cyprus, the Aegean Islands, and Egypt. Almonds travel beside wine, olive oil, timber, metals, pottery, dried figs, and grain. Compared with fragile fresh fruit, they are well suited to maritime exchange. Their shells protect them from handling salt air and moderate changes in temperature. They occupy little space relative to their food value and can remain edible through a voyage lasting weeks or months. A ship does not need to carry almonds as its principal cargo for the crop to spread. A few bags may serve as provisions for sailors. Merchants may offer them as expensive delicacies in distant markets. Migrants may bring seeds from familiar trees when establishing new homes. Some kernels are eaten, but others survive long enough to be planted. In this way, commercial transport and agricultural expansion blend together. The same network that carries food for consumption also carries the possibility of new orchards. The Phoenician trading world likely contributes to this movement across the Mediterranean. From cities along the Levantine coast, Phoenician sailors established colonies and trading stations westward through Cyprus, North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, the Iberian Peninsula, and beyond. Archaeological evidence does not allow every almond tree to be traced to a specific voyage, and scholars still debate the precise role different maritime peoples played in spreading particular crops. What survives in the record suggests, however, that connected port communities helped move cultivated plants rapidly between regions with similar climates. The almond finds favourable conditions throughout much of the Mediterranean basin. Winters are cool and relatively wet. Summers are hot and dry. Rocky slopes resemble the environments in which wild almond relatives already thrive. Farmers familiar with olives, grapes, figs, and pomegranates can fit almond trees into mixed orchards and field margins. The tree requires knowledge, but not an entirely new agricultural world. In North Africa, almonds spread along coastal zones and into mountain regions where winter rain supports tree cultivation. Egypt presents a different challenge. The Nile Valley is fertile, but its climate and flood-based agriculture differ from the upland environments favoured by many almond varieties. Almonds can still be grown in gardens and carefully managed estates, yet imported kernels may remain important, especially for elite consumption. References and physical remains indicate that almonds are known in ancient Egypt, though the scale and source of local production remain uncertain. Some may arrive through trade from the Levant rather than from extensive Egyptian orchards. To the east, almond cultivation moves through the Iranian plateau and into Central and South Asia. These routes later become famous as parts of the Silk Roads, but plant exchange begins long before that name is used. Mountain passes, oasis towns, caravan tracks, and seasonal migration corridors connect communities across enormous distances. Traders carry textiles, metals, spices, horses, glass, and precious stones. But they also move ordinary biological material seeds, cuttings, fruits, grains, and animals. The almond is especially suited to this overland world. Caravans need foods that provide energy without spoiling rapidly. Shelled or unshelled almonds can supplement dried meat, bread, cheese, and fruit. Their oils help sustain travellers crossing arid country where fresh supplies are unreliable. A kernel eaten on the road disappears from history, but one planted at an oasis can alter the agriculture of that place for generations. As the tree enters new regions, it encounters different winters, flowering seasons, soils, pests, and pollinators. Not every imported variety succeeds. A tree adapted to a mild coast may flower too early in a colder interior valley and lose its crop to frost. Another may survive drought but fail to produce because compatible pollinating trees are absent. Expansion, therefore, depends on continued selection. Farmers preserve seedlings that perform well locally and abandon those that do not. This creates regional almond traditions. Some areas favour hard shells that protect kernels from insects and long transport. Others select softer shells that are easier to open. flowering time becomes crucial in colder zones. While drought tolerance matters in dry interior landscapes, kernel shape, size, flavor, and oil content vary. The almond spreading across continents is not one fixed plant. It becomes a family of cultivated forms, each shaped by human preference and local pressure. Expanding states accelerate this process by moving both people and agricultural knowledge. Soldiers settle in conquered lands, administrators establish estates, captive populations and labourers are relocated. Farmers follow roads maintained for military or commercial purposes. Empires rarely spread crops according to a single plan, but their infrastructure allows plants to travel farther and more regularly. Roads reduce isolation. Ports concentrate goods. Tax systems encourage production of valuable commodities. Royal and temple gardens test species brought from distant provinces. The Persian empires connect the eastern Mediterranean with Mesopotamia, Iran, Central Asia, and parts of South Asia. Later, Hellenistic kingdoms extend Greek-speaking political networks across many of the same regions. Roman power then binds much of the Mediterranean and Western Europe into another vast system of roads and sea lanes. Almonds move through all of these worlds, sometimes as trade goods, sometimes as orchard plants, and sometimes simply as familiar food carried by people whose journeys go unrecorded. The tree's spread northward into Europe is limited by climate. Almonds can grow in warmer parts of the continent, especially around the Mediterranean coast and sheltered river valleys, but late frost remains a constant threat. In colder zones, the almond may survive as a rare garden tree without producing reliable crops. Imported kernels therefore travel farther than successful orchards. A person in northern Europe can know the taste of almonds even where no local farmer can depend on harvesting them. This separation between production and consumption increases the nut's value. In regions close to orchards, almonds may be ordinary seasonal food, hundreds of kilometers away. They become expensive ingredients carried through multiple markets. Their price reflects transport, spoilage risk, taxes, and the profits of intermediaries. The almond's hard shell, once a natural defense against animals, now protects a commodity moving through human economies. Trade also spreads ideas about how almonds should be used. Recipes travel with merchants, cooks, physicians, religious communities, and migrants. Kernels are eaten raw or roasted, crushed into sauces, combined with honey, pressed for oil, or used in medical preparations. One culture may emphasize their nutritional value, another their symbolic meaning, and another their place in elite cuisine. The crop gains layers of identity as it crosses borders, yet the old danger travels with it. Bitter almond varieties remain useful for oil, fragrance, medicine, and specialized preparations, but they require caution. Sweet and bitter trees can grow near one another, and imported seeds may produce uncertain offspring. Knowledge of which varieties are safe must accompany the plant. Where that knowledge is lost, the almond can return to its original role as a seed carrying an invisible threat. No single map can show the precise path of this expansion. Archaeological remains are uneven, ancient plant names can be ambiguous, and later orchards often erase the traces of earlier ones. Scholars still debate whether some regional almond populations descend mainly from imported cultivated trees or from local wild relatives brought under management. The evidence remains incomplete, and repeated hybridization has blurred many ancient boundaries. What is clear is that the almond thrives within connection. It follows coastlines, caravan routes, imperial roads, river valleys, mountain passes, and networks of migration. Each journey removes it farther from the place where sweetness first becomes valuable to humans. By the time the tree is established across much of the Mediterranean and deep into Asia, the almond is no longer merely a domesticated plant of one region. It has become a traveller, carried by the same forces that move languages, technologies, beliefs, and empires. By the time almonds become familiar across the Greek and Roman worlds, they carry more than nourishment. They arrive in markets as durable food, in gardens as valuable trees, in medical texts as potent ingredients, and in stories as symbols of desire, marriage, rebirth, and uncertain fertility. The seed that once demanded careful testing now appears in societies with specialized growers, merchants, cooks, physicians, and religious traditions, yet its older identity has not disappeared. Sweet almonds are prized, bitter almonds are treated with caution, and ancient writers remain aware that two nearly identical kernels can have very different effects. In the Greek-speaking Eastern Mediterranean, almonds fit naturally into a food culture already shaped by olives, grapes, figs, cereals, pulses, honey, and aromatic herbs. They can be eaten fresh after the hull begins to open, dried for storage, toasted, crushed, or mixed into richer preparations. Their concentrated oils and proteins make them useful during journeys and military movement, while their cost and portability also allow them to serve as gifts or trade goods, near productive districts. They may be ordinary enough to appear in household stores, in cities far from orchards, particularly where climate limits local cultivation. They become more expensive and more closely associated with wealth. Greek terminology for the almond passes into later scientific and medical language, preserving evidence of how deeply the plant enters Mediterranean thought. Ancient authors distinguish between sweet and bitter kinds, though their classifications do not always correspond neatly to modern botanical categories. Some descriptions may refer to different varieties, stages of ripeness, or closely related species. Plant names travel between languages and regions, and the same word can shift in meaning over centuries. Scholars still debate the identity of certain ancient nuts because texts often describe flavor and use more clearly than leaf shape, flower structure, or genetics. Agricultural knowledge becomes increasingly detailed. Growers understand that almond trees prefer land that drains well, and that excessive moisture can damage them. They recognize the danger of frost during flowering and the value of placing trees in favorable exposures. Propagation from seed remains possible, but grafting and budding offer a way to preserve desirable trees. Greek and later Roman agricultural traditions discuss methods for improving fruit trees, though the surviving instructions sometimes blend careful observation with practices that modern horticulture would not support. What matters is the seriousness with which orchard management is approached. The almond is no longer left to chance on a distant slope. Its performance is studied. Its flowers make it particularly visible in the cultural imagination. Almond trees bloom early, sometimes while winter still holds the surrounding land. A bare branch can suddenly carry pale pink or white blossoms before most other trees show new growth. This timing links the almond with renewal, but it also exposes its vulnerability. The bloom may appear to announce spring and then be destroyed by frost. For communities dependent on seasonal cycles, that contrast is powerful. Beauty arrives before safety. One Greek tale later associated with the almond concerns a woman transformed into a tree after grief and separation, with blossoms appearing when her absent lover returns. Different versions survive, and the details change across authors and periods. The story should not be treated as evidence of a single universal almond cult, but it reflects a recurring symbolic pattern, the flowering tree as an image of fidelity, longing, and life returning after apparent death. Myth gives emotional meaning to a biological event that farmers witness every year. Almonds also acquire associations with marriage and fertility. Their numerous blossoms, hidden kernels, and early renewal make them suitable symbols of abundance. Nuts and dried fruits can be scattered, offered, or shared during ceremonies, although customs vary widely across time and place. Later traditions sometimes project their own practices backward onto Greece and Rome, so the evidence must be handled carefully. What survives in the record suggests that almonds participate in a broader Mediterranean symbolism surrounding seeds, fruitfulness, household prosperity, and the hope for future generations. The Romans inherit almond cultivation from the interconnected agricultural worlds around them and spread it through an empire that links the Mediterranean coast with inland Europe, North Africa, and Western Asia. Roman merchants transport almonds as food, while landowners cultivate them where conditions permit. Agricultural writers include almond trees within wider discussions of orchards, soils, pruning, grafting, and estate management. Their recommendations reveal a practical awareness of variation. Some trees produce sweeter kernels, some bear more reliably, and some perform better in particular ground. Roman expansion carries almond trees into new districts, but climate limits their success. In southern Italy, Sicily, parts of Iberia, coastal North Africa, and other Mediterranean environments, orchards can become productive. Farther north, the tree may grow in sheltered places yet suffer repeated crop failures because its blossoms open too early. This creates an imperial geography in which almonds are cultivated in warm provinces and shipped toward colder regions. A kernel eaten near the Rhine may have travelled through warehouses, river ports, roads, and military supply networks before reaching its final consumer. Archaeological discoveries from Roman settlements provide physical evidence of this circulation. Almond shells and kernels have been recovered from houses, drains, rubbish deposits, military sites, and towns buried by disaster. At Pompeii and Herculaneum, the eruption of Vesuvius preserves food remains alongside kitchens, shops, gardens, storage containers, and dining spaces. Nuts survive carbonized or sealed beneath volcanic material, offering rare glimpses into ordinary consumption. They do not reveal every recipe, but they confirm that almonds belong to the edible landscape of Roman urban life. In wealthier households, almonds can enter elaborate dishes combining sweet, salty, sour, and aromatic flavors. Roman cooking often uses ingredients in combinations unfamiliar to modern diners: fruit with meat, honey with pepper, fermented fish sauce with herbs, and nuts as thickeners or garnishes. Almonds may be crushed into mixtures, added to pastries or sweetened preparations, or served among dried fruits at the end of a meal. The surviving culinary record is heavily weighted toward elite food, so it cannot be assumed that ordinary people ate the same dishes. Most inhabitants of the empire depend primarily on grain, legumes, vegetables, oil, and whatever local foods they can afford. The almond's oil also has value. Kernels can be pressed to produce a light oil used in food, skin preparations, perfumes, and medicinal compounds. Bitter and sweet almonds may be assigned different properties. Physicians working in Greek and Roman traditions describe almonds as warming, cleansing, soothing, or useful for particular complaints according to ancient theories of the body. Bitter almonds are sometimes recommended in small quantities for conditions involving the skin, digestion, breathing, or internal parasites. Such uses reflect historical medical systems rather than modern clinical evidence, and some would carry real risk because dosage is difficult to control. Writers such as Dioscorides and Pliny preserve extensive discussions of plants, blending observation, inherited tradition, hearsay, and occasional superstition. Their accounts show that ancient people understand the bitter almond as unusually powerful. They may not know that amygdalin can release cyanide, but they recognize that bitterness signals a stronger physiological effect. The distinction between medicine and poison depends on quantity, preparation, and the condition being treated. No single explanation fully accounts for how safely these remedies were used. Some may have been carefully controlled, while others undoubtedly caused harm that left no clear record. A lesser-known detail is that ancient authors sometimes suggest almonds before drinking wine, believing they could delay drunkenness or protect against its effects. The claim becomes part of a long tradition surrounding nuts and alcohol, though modern evidence does not support almonds as an antidote to intoxication. Eating fatty, protein-rich food can slow the absorption of alcohol when consumed as part of a meal, which may have helped give the practice an appearance of effectiveness. Ancient interpretation then expands a modest dietary effect into a medicinal reputation. Almonds also appear in offerings and funerary contexts, where food connects the living, the dead, and the gods. Nuts are compact symbols of stored life, protected inside shells and capable of producing a tree. Yet archaeological deposits are difficult to interpret. An almond placed in a tomb may be an offering, travel provision for the dead, part of a funeral meal, or ordinary debris mixed into the fill. The evidence remains incomplete, and ritual meaning cannot always be separated from practical food use. Across Greece and Rome, the almond thus occupies several worlds at once. It is common enough to be stored and eaten, valuable enough to be traded, beautiful enough to inspire symbolism, and chemically complex enough to attract physicians. Empires do not create the almond, but they enlarge its range and multiply its meanings. The tree that once stood as a dangerous exception in a mountain landscape now flowers in private gardens, commercial orchards, sacred stories, medical recipes. In urban markets, its sweetness has become familiar, but the memory of bitterness remains close beneath the shell. The almond does not enter the medieval Islamic world as an unknown plant. It is already ancient, already cultivated from the Levant to the Western Mediterranean, and already surrounded by Greek, Roman, Persian, Jewish, Christian, and local farming traditions. What changes after the 7th century is not the invention of the crop, but the scale of the world through which its knowledge can circulate. Political and commercial networks connect Iberia and North Africa with Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Central Asia, and ports reaching toward the Indian Ocean. Within this enormous and diverse zone, farmers exchange varieties, gardeners compare methods, physicians preserve earlier plant lore, and cooks give the almond a new culinary reach. The phrase Islamic agriculture can sound as though one uniform system suddenly replaces everything before it, but the reality is more complicated. Agriculture under Muslim rule draws on many older foundations: Roman and Byzantine orchards in the Mediterranean, irrigation traditions from Persia and Mesopotamia, oasis farming in Arabia, and the accumulated practices of Berber, Egyptian, Syrian, Iraqi, Iranian, Andalusi, and other communities. Scholars still debate how revolutionary the changes truly were and which crops were newly introduced into particular regions. The evidence remains incomplete, but surviving Arabic agricultural literature shows a sustained effort to organize knowledge about soils, water, grafting, pruning, manuring, pests, and fruit trees. Philaha, org, JOTPS, Joston, WW, Philaha, org, medieval, agricultural. Ajikal UTM source, chatgpt.com. Almonds benefit from this close horticultural observation. Farmers understand that a tree cannot be treated like an annual crop. Its location will shape harvest for decades. Poor drainage can weaken the roots. Too much water may encourage disease, while too little during critical growth limits the kernel. Early flowering makes exposure important, since a warm, sheltered place may encourage blossoms before danger has passed. Success depends on matching a variety to a particular slope, soil, and climate rather than assuming every almond behaves alike. Agricultural authors preserve this knowledge in books of cultivation. In Al-Andalus, writers such as Ibn Basl and, later, Ibn al-Awwam compile material from earlier authorities and practical experience. Ibn al-Awwam's extensive book of agriculture discusses cultivated species, grafting, pruning, soil preparation, and irrigation, reflecting a world in which orchard work is examined systematically. Written instructions do not prove that every recommendation was followed, but they preserve a remarkable conversation between scholarship and the realities of the field. Kittel. QSHTPS DW QAN Archive Gast 810 Vers He's on one Vers do Vers 8 0 sales Jeff Sebs and UTM Source Gast ChatGPT.com. Grafting is central to preserving desirable almonds. A seed may produce an uncertain tree, but a bud or shoot taken from a proven sweet variety can reproduce its qualities more reliably when joined to a suitable rootstock. Medieval growers refined several techniques and pay attention to the compatibility of fruit trees. Some recommendations are sound, others doubtful, and a few reflect inherited theories that modern botany does not accept. Yet the larger achievement remains clear. Grafting allows farmers to keep a successful almond alive in many bodies, carrying the same valued traits from one orchard to another. Rootstock offers another layer of control. A grower can use a hardy seedling adapted to dry or stony soil, then graft onto it a variety known for good kernels. The roots provide endurance, while the upper branches provide the desired crop. A graft can fail, disease can enter the wound, and frost can still destroy the flowers. But the method reduces the uncertainty that once forced cultivators to wait years for every seedling to reveal whether it was sweet or bitter. Water management also shapes the almond's medieval history. Established trees tolerate dryness better than many crops, yet young trees and productive orchards benefit from well-timed water. Across Islamic regions, irrigation takes many forms: wells, reservoir, canals, underground channels, river diversions, lifting devices, and carefully scheduled turns within shared systems. In Al-Andalus, channel networks distribute water through cultivated zones occupied by orchards, vegetables, and grains. Almonds do not demand the intensive irrigation required by some garden crops, but they profit from water directed strategically during establishment and severe drought. Tanfonline, scum httpn, tanfonline, com doi, full, 10.10.16j, Gemedist. 2005.03 new one UTM source, ChatGPT.com. These systems depend as much on social agreement as engineering. Water must be divided, channels cleared, disputes resolved, and timing observed. A tree standing in an irrigated garden is connected to law, custom, labour, and neighbourhood cooperation. Its survival may depend on a gate opened at the right hour several kilometres away. The almond's hardiness remains valuable, but cultivation draws it into an organised human ecology. Across North Africa, the Middle East, and Al-Andalus, almonds often grow among other trees rather than in isolated single-crop orchards. Olives, figs, pomegranates, vines, apricots, citrus, and palms can share carefully arranged spaces, with vegetables or fodder below where light and water permit. Mixed cultivation spreads risk and uses different layers of soil and sunlight. It creates landscapes that appear lush, not because water is unlimited, but because it is controlled with precision. The almond's preservation is culinary as well as agricultural. Medieval Arabic cookbooks reveal a broad cuisine extending from Baghdad and Syria to Egypt, North Africa, and Iberia. Almonds appear with sugar, honey, rosewater, spices, meats, grains, and fruit. They are ground into pastes, used to enrich sauces, pressed into oils, scattered over dishes, and shaped into sweets. Their mildness absorbs aromatic flavours, while their fat gives body to foods that might otherwise be thin. The surviving cookbooks favour urban and elite households, so they cannot describe everyone's daily meals, but they show how highly the almond is valued. UNESCO.org, https www UNESCO.org EN articles gas 1001. Ingredients: medieval Arab cuisines, rich. Heritage utem sauce, ChatGPT.com. A particularly important preparation is almond milk. Ground kernels mixed with water produce a pale liquid that can thicken dishes and carry flavour. It remains useful where fresh animal milk is unavailable or difficult to preserve. Almond milk enters sweet dishes, savoury stews, medicinal preparations, and foods shaped by religious dietary practice. It will later become deeply important in Christian European kitchens during fasting periods. But within Islamic cuisine it already belongs to a wider tradition of extracting richness from nuts. Physicians and pharmacists continue to distinguish sweet from bitter almonds. Drawing on Greek medical heritage and developing it within Arabic scholarly traditions, they describe almond oils and kernels in treatments for the skin, digestion, coughing, pain, and other complaints. Some applications are relatively gentle. Others involving bitter almonds carry genuine toxic danger. Medieval practitioners recognize that bitter varieties are more forceful. Even though they do not understand cyanide chemistry, as in earlier medicine, the boundary between remedy and poison depends on dose, preparation, and judgment. Trade carries these products and practices between regions. Almonds move as kernels, oil, sweets, medicinal ingredients, seeds, and grafting material. Pilgrims, scholars, soldiers, artisans, merchants, and displaced families transfer knowledge alongside the crop. The movement is rarely one-directional. Andalusi growers learn from Eastern texts and local Iberian experience. North African and Sicilian farmers adapt techniques to their own climates. Eastern markets absorb products and preferences from many provinces. It would be misleading to claim that Islamic societies simply introduce the almond wherever they rule. The tree is known in the Roman Mediterranean and may already grow in parts of Iberia and Sicily before Muslim conquest. The deeper contribution lies in continuity, intensification, adaptation, and transmission. Existing orchards are maintained, regional varieties are refined, agricultural writing preserves techniques, and culinary traditions expand the almond's uses. No single explanation fully accounts for its success, but the connected world of medieval Islam gives the crop many routes through which to endure. When political borders shift, the trees remain. An orchard planted under one dynasty may be harvested under another. A grafting method written in Arabic can pass into the practice of a Christian or Jewish grower. A sweet made in an Andalusi kitchen can survive under a different name centuries later. The almond's history is preserved not only in manuscripts, but in repeated gestures, cutting a bud, opening a water channel, grinding kernels on stone, and planting a tree whose harvest belongs to the future. As almond cultivation and culinary knowledge move through the Mediterranean, the nut enters the kitchens of medieval Christian Europe with unusual advantages. It stores well, travels well, and can be transformed into something that resembles one of the most restricted foods in the religious calendar. During long periods of fasting, When meat and often dairy products are forbidden, ground almonds mixed with water produce a rich pale liquid that can stand in for milk. This simple preparation helps turn the almond from an imported luxury into one of the most useful ingredients in the medieval kitchen. Fasting is not a minor interruption in medieval life. Across much of Christian Europe, the calendar contains numerous days when dietary rules shape what people may eat. Lent is the most famous, but weekly fasts, saints' days, vigils, and local observances can add many more restrictions. The exact rules vary by time, place, social status, and religious authority. Yet the broad effect is clear. Cooks must find ways to create satisfying food without the ingredients that usually provide richness. Almonds offer an answer because their oils give body to broths, sauces, porridges, and sweets. To make almond milk, kernels are blanched to loosen their skins, crushed in a mortar, and mixed with warm water or another liquid. The paste is then strained through cloth. The result is not identical to animal milk, but it is smooth, mildly sweet, and remarkably adaptable. It can thicken a dish, soften strong spices, carry the flavor of herbs, and give pale color to recipes where appearance matters, because it is made fresh from dried nuts. It avoids some of the storage problems of cow's or goat's milk in a world without refrigeration. This quality makes almond milk useful beyond fasting. Fresh dairy can sour quickly, especially in warm weather or crowded urban kitchens. Almonds can remain in storage until needed. A cook can produce only as much liquid as a meal requires, reducing waste in wealthy households, where elaborate food is expected even on restricted days. Almond milk becomes a practical foundation for sauces, soups, custards, and ceremonial dishes. What begins as a substitute acquires prestige of its own. Monasteries play an important role in preserving and spreading these practices. Religious communities manage gardens, orchards, kitchens, guest houses, infirmaries, and storerooms. Some monasteries grow almonds in suitable southern regions, while others obtain them through merchants or estates. Monastic cooks must follow fasting rules closely, yet they also feed large communities, care for the sick, and receive travelers of varying rank. Almonds provide concentrated nourishment in a form compatible with religious discipline. The monastery is not an isolated world. It stands within a network of farms, roads, markets, tolls, and obligations. Tenants may deliver food as rent, donors provide land or produce, merchants bring spices, dried fruits, fish, wine, oil, and nuts from distant regions. Almonds arriving at a northern monastery may have passed through several hands, moving from Mediterranean orchards to coastal ports, river towns, regional markets, and finally a monastic storehouse. Their presence in a fasting dish reflects an economic system reaching far beyond the cloister walls. Medieval recipe collections reveal how thoroughly almonds enter elite European cooking. They're ground into sauces served with fish, poultry, or meat outside fast periods. They thicken stews and provide a smooth texture that grain or bread alone cannot always achieve. Combined with sugar, honey, or dried fruit, they become fillings, pastes, and confections. Mixed with vinegar, wine, spices, and broth, they can produce sauces that are rich, sharp, sweet, and aromatic at the same time. These flavors belong to a culinary world different from the modern separation of sweet and savory. Medieval cooks frequently combined sugar with meat, fruit with fish, and spices with nearly everything expensive enough to display status. Almonds function as a bridge between these tastes. Their mild flavor does not dominate the dish, allowing pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, saffron, vinegar, or honey to remain prominent. Their oils, however, give the mixture weight and smoothness. One famous family of preparations turns ground almonds and sugar into a dense paste resembling later marzipan. The precise origin of marzipan remains disputed, with several regions claiming early forms and different traditions using different names. What survives in the record suggests that sweet almond pastes circulate through Mediterranean and Islamic cuisines before becoming firmly established in European confectionery. By the later Middle Ages, wealthy kitchens use almonds and sugar to create shaped sweets, decorative objects, and elaborate banquet pieces. Sugar is crucial to this transformation. For much of medieval Europe, it is expensive, imported, and closely associated with medicine and luxury. Combining it with almonds produces a food that is both calorie-rich and prestigious. Apothecaries, confectioners, and court cooks all work with similar ingredients, blurring the boundary between remedy and treat. A sweet almond preparation may be offered to strengthen the body, aid digestion, impress a guest, or complete a feast. Almonds also enter a dish known in various forms as blancmange, whose medieval ancestors are very different from the modern dessert. Early versions can include shredded chicken or fish, rice, almond milk, sugar, and spices, producing a pale, smooth dish valued for both appearance and refinement. The whiteness matters. In elite food culture, colour can signal purity, expense, and skill. Almond milk helps create that controlled pale surface while adding richness. The surviving recipe books mostly describe the food of courts, monasteries, wealthy households, and urban elites. They do not mean that ordinary peasants regularly ate almond sauces or sculpted sweets. For many people in Northern Europe, almonds remain costly imports purchased in small quantities or encountered during special occasions. Grain, cabbage, onions, beans, and local dairy dominate everyday survival, yet even limited use matters. A few almonds added to a feast or religious meal can carry symbolic weight far beyond their quantity. In Mediterranean regions, the social picture is different. Where almond trees grow locally, kernels may be more accessible and woven into household cooking. Families roast them, add them to breads, combine them with honey, or grind them into sauces without the same sense of distant luxury. Climate creates class distinctions in flavour. The farther the almond travels from a productive orchard, the more likely it is to become an object of status. Merchant networks respond to this demand. Almonds pass through fairs, harbour cities, and warehouse districts alongside raisins, figs, spices, and sugar. Traders must judge quality, moisture, damage, and origin. Kernels can become rancid if stored poorly, while shells add weight but protect the contents. Different markets prefer almonds shelled or unshelled depending on transport distance and intended use. Taxes, tolls, warfare, piracy, and failed harvests all affect price. A poor flowering season in one region can therefore be felt far away. Late frost in an orchard district reduces supply. Merchants raise prices. Monastic kitchens use smaller quantities. Court cooks substitute another thickener or reserve almonds for the most important dishes. The crop becomes part of an interconnected economy, in which weather on a distant hillside influences the contents of a noble table. The old danger of bitterness remains present. Medieval cooks and merchants distinguish good, sweet almonds from bitter ones. Though sorting is not perfect, bitter almonds may still be used deliberately in small amounts for flavour, oil, or medicine. Their intensity can seem valuable, but the risk is real. No single explanation fully accounts for how often poisoning occurred, since symptoms may have been attributed to illness, spoiled food, or divine judgment rather than to a specific kernel. By the end of the Middle Ages, the almond has achieved something unusual. It is simultaneously an orchard crop, a trade commodity, a fasting necessity, a medicine, and a luxury. It moves from monastery storerooms to city markets, from merchant kitchens to royal banquets, changing form at every stage. Ground into milk, it helps cooks obey religious restrictions without surrendering richness. Mixed with sugar, it becomes a symbol of refinement. Hidden inside these elegant preparations is the memory of the wild seed that once resisted consumption with poison. The almond's journey across the Atlantic begins as part of a much larger movement of plants, animals, people, and diseases that reshapes the world after the late 15th century. European ships carry wheat, grapes, olives, citrus, sugarcane, livestock, and fruit tree seeds into lands where none of these species has evolved. Almonds travel among them, sometimes as food for the voyage, sometimes as seeds intended for gardens and orchards, and sometimes as a familiar crop brought by settlers who hope to reproduce Mediterranean life on unfamiliar soil. Yet carrying an almond across an ocean is easier than making it thrive on the other side. The first European colonies in the Americas occupy environments ranging from humid tropical islands to high plateaus and dry coastal valleys. Almond trees require a particular combination of conditions. They need enough winter cold to complete dormancy, but not so much that severe freezes damage the wood. They need warm, dry summers. Yet their early blossoms remain vulnerable to late frost. They also need suitable pollinating partners and insects active during the brief flowering period. In many colonial regions, one or more of these requirements are missing. Spanish colonists and missionaries introduce almonds into parts of Mexico, South America, and the regions that later become the southwestern United States. The tree performs best where the climate resembles the Mediterranean cool, wet winters, dry summers, and well-drained soil. In areas that are too humid, fungal diseases become more severe. In tropical lowlands, winter dormancy may be insufficient. In colder interiors, frost destroys the flowers. The crop survives in scattered gardens and mission orchards, but it does not immediately become a major American commodity. California eventually provides the landscape in which the almond can expand on an unprecedented scale. Spanish missionaries establish a chain of missions along the coast beginning in the 18th century, bringing European crops into a region already inhabited and managed by indigenous peoples for thousands of years. Mission gardens contain vines, olives, figs, citrus, wheat, and various fruit and nut trees, including almonds. These early plantings demonstrate that the tree can survive. But production remains limited. Coastal conditions, unsuitable varieties, inconsistent care, and the small scale of cultivation prevent the emergence of a major industry. The almond's true American transformation occurs farther inland, particularly in California's Central Valley. This enormous lowland lies between mountain ranges, with hot, dry summers and winters cool enough for many almond varieties. Rivers descending from the Sierra Nevada provide water, while deep alluvial soils support extensive agriculture. The landscape appears almost designed for Mediterranean orchard crops, but its modern productivity depends on irrigation, engineering, labor, and ecological change rather than climate alone. During the 19th century, California passes through dramatic political and economic transitions. Mexican rule gives way to United States control. The gold rush draws migrants from across the world, and expanding towns create new markets for food. Farmers experiment with crops that can supply both local consumers and distant buyers. Almonds attract attention because the kernels are valuable, durable, and suitable for transport. Yet early attempts frequently fail. Growers initially plant many varieties imported from Europe, often without knowing whether they are adapted to local conditions. Some trees bloom too early and lose their flowers to frost. Others produce poorly because they cannot pollinate themselves. A variety may appear healthy, covering itself in blossoms every spring, while yielding only a disappointing handful of nuts. Farmers who plant isolated blocks of genetically identical trees may not understand that pollen from a compatible variety is required. The biology that once bound wild almonds to diverse mountain groves now creates a commercial obstacle. Most traditional almond varieties are self-incompatible. Their own pollen cannot reliably fertilize their flowers, even when it reaches the correct structures. Two compatible varieties must bloom at roughly the same time, and insects must carry pollen between them. An orchard can therefore fail not because the soil is poor or the trees are weak, but because the wrong trees stand beside one another. Through experimentation, California growers begin identifying combinations that work. They plant alternating rows of compatible cultivars. They compare flowering dates, shell hardness, kernel quality, yield, and resistance to local pests. Nurseries propagate promising varieties by grafting, preserving successful genetic lines rather than gambling on seedlings. Gradually, the orchard becomes more carefully designed. Every tree is part of a reproductive system planned across rows and acres. Among the varieties that rise to importance is one eventually known as nonpareil, a French name meaning unequaled. Its thin shell makes processing easy, and its smooth, attractive kernel appeals to buyers. It becomes a foundation of the California industry, though it cannot stand alone. Pollinizer varieties must flower beside it, creating orchards composed of several interdependent genetic types. The most commercially valuable tree still relies on companions. California's dry summers reduce some disease pressures and allow harvested almonds to dry naturally. But summer rainfall is too limited for dependable high yields. Irrigation becomes essential. Canals, wells, reservoirs, pumps, and later vast state and federal water projects transform the Central Valley. Water once moving through rivers, wetlands, and seasonal floodplains is redirected into agricultural land. Almond trees spread into areas where rainfall alone could never support dense orchards. This expansion brings remarkable productivity, but it also begins the environmental tension that follows the crop into the modern age. Almond trees are drought-tolerant compared with some plants when survival alone is considered, yet a commercial orchard is not managed merely to stay alive. It is expected to produce large, uniform crops every year. High yields require substantial water, particularly in the hot Central Valley. Once planted, the trees represent a long-term investment and cannot simply be left unwatered during a dry season without risking years of future production. Labour is equally important. Orchards must be planted, grafted, pruned, irrigated, protected, harvested, and processed. Chinese, Japanese, Mexican, Filipino, European, and other immigrant workers contribute to California agriculture under conditions often marked by discrimination, low wages, and unstable rights. The polished commercial almond conceals this human history. Its success depends not only on climate and genetics, but on generations of workers whose names rarely appear in accounts of agricultural innovation. Harvesting initially remains laborious. Workers knock almonds from branches with poles, gather them from the ground, remove hulls, and carry heavy sacks. Dust rises beneath the trees, shell fragments cut hands. Timing matters because nuts left too long may be damaged by insects, moisture, or animals. As orchards expand, the demand for faster methods increases, setting the stage for machines that will later shake entire trees and sweep the fallen crop into organized rows. Railways and improved shipping allow California almonds to reach Eastern American cities and international markets. The same qualities that once made almonds suitable for caravans and medieval storerooms now suit industrial distribution. Kernels can cross a continent without refrigeration. Shelling, grading, and packaging create standardized products, while advertising encourages consumers to see almonds not as rare imported luxuries but as dependable household food. The evidence remains incomplete about every early introduction and failed orchard, because unsuccessful trees often disappear without record. Scholars and agricultural historians still debate the exact routes by which particular varieties reached California and how much different immigrant farming traditions contributed to their adaptation. What survives most clearly is the result. A crop originating in the dry mountains of Asia finds another vast dry landscape where human engineering can multiply it. By the early 20th century, California is no longer merely experimenting with almonds. It is beginning to reorganize the crop around commercial scale. Suitable climate, imported varieties, grafting expertise, irrigation, pollination management, transportation, and expanding demand finally converge. The almond has crossed an ocean and entered a new phase, one in which an orchard is no longer a cluster of trees beside a village, but part of an industrial landscape stretching toward the horizon. The industrial almond orchard takes shape when growers stop treating each tree as an individual source of food and begin managing entire landscapes as coordinated machines. The change does not happen in a single invention. It emerges through many linked improvements, better varieties, planned pollination, irrigation systems, mechanical harvesting, centralized processing, refrigerated transport where needed, standardized grading, and marketing capable of creating demand thousands of kilometers from the orchard. By the middle of the 20th century, the almond is entering a world in which success depends less on the character of one hillside and more on the efficiency of an entire supply chain. The most visible transformation occurs at harvest. For centuries, almonds are knocked from branches by hand, collected from the ground, hulled, dried, and sorted through exhausting seasonal labor. As California orchards expand, this method becomes too slow and expensive. Mechanical tree shakers provide the answer. A machine approaches the trunk, grips it with padded arms, and vibrates the entire tree for a few seconds. The branches tremble violently, and thousands of almonds fall in a sudden dry rain. What once required teams of workers with poles can now be completed by an operator moving rapidly from tree to tree. The process appears simple, but it requires the orchard itself to be redesigned. Trunks must be accessible to machinery. Rows must be wide and straight enough for vehicles. The ground beneath the canopy must be level, dry, and relatively free of weeds, stones, and fallen branches. Almonds cannot be collected efficiently from muddy or uneven soil. Growers therefore manage the orchard floor almost as carefully as the trees, preparing a clean surface on which the harvest can dry. After shaking, The almonds remain on the ground for several days. Exposed to California's hot, dry late summer air, this natural drying reduces moisture before collection, helping prevent mold and spoilage. Sweeping machines then move through the orchard, brushing the fallen crop into narrow rows. Pickup machines lift the almonds with dust, leaves, twigs, and fragments of hull, beginning a journey through increasingly specialized equipment. At the processing plant, the harvest is separated into its parts. Hulls are removed, shells are cracked when the product is intended to be sold as kernels, and machinery sorts the almonds by size, shape, color, and visible damage. Air currents, screens, rollers, cameras, and later electronic sensors distinguish good kernels from shell fragments, stones, insect-damaged nuts, and foreign material. Human inspectors remain important, but machines allow vast quantities to be processed with a consistency that hand sorting cannot match. The discarded material does not necessarily become waste. Hulls can be used as livestock feed, particularly for cattle, though their nutritional quality varies. Shells can serve as fuel, bedding, industrial material, or soil amendment. Research continues into extracting additional value from these byproducts. The industrial orchard aims to use every part of the harvest, turning what once accumulated beside village-cracking stones into secondary commodities. Standardization changes how almonds are sold. Earlier buyers may judge a shipment by tasting a handful, inspecting the shells, or trusting a merchant's reputation. Industrial markets require grades. Kernels are classified by dimensions: appearance, breakage, moisture, and the presence of defects. Buyers purchasing thousands of kilograms need confidence that one shipment will resemble the next. The almond gradually becomes less associated with a particular tree or farmer and more with a recognized commercial category. This consistency allows food manufacturers to use almonds on a new scale. Bakeries, confectionery companies, breakfast cereal producers, snack businesses, and later makers of plant-based drinks need predictable supplies. A factory cannot easily adjust every recipe because one orchard produces smaller, oilier, or more bitter kernels than another. Commercial breeding and variety selection therefore focus not only on yield but also on uniformity. Growers seek trees that bloom at useful times, produce large crops, release their hulls cleanly, withstand mechanical shaking, and create kernels suited to processing. Thin shells reduce cracking costs but may offer less protection from insects. Hard shells protect the kernel but add weight and require more energy to process. Early bloom can lengthen the growing season but increases frost risk. Every desirable trait comes with a compromise. Breeding tree crops is slow. A new almond seedling may take years to produce enough fruit for meaningful evaluation. Researchers must then observe it through different weather conditions, disease outbreaks, and harvest seasons. A tree that performs brilliantly in one year may fail in the next. Promising selections are grafted and tested in several locations before growers risk planting them across large acreages. The evidence remains incomplete after only a few seasons. And patience remains essential even within industrial agriculture. Universities, government agricultural stations, nurseries, and private growers all contribute to this work. They test pollinizer combinations, study irrigation timing, compare rootstocks, and monitor pests. Improved knowledge turns the orchard into a carefully measured biological system. Flowering dates are recorded, kernel yields are calculated, water applications are scheduled, insect populations are trapped and counted. The tree remains alive and unpredictable, but its performance is increasingly translated into data. Pest control becomes more organized as orchards grow larger and more uniform. Insects such as the navel orangeworm can damage kernels and contaminate harvested nuts. Mites weaken leaves. Fungal diseases attack blossoms or branches under favorable conditions. A dense landscape containing thousands of similar trees offers pests an enormous continuous food source. Industrial agriculture responds with sanitation, monitoring resistant varieties, pesticides, and changes in harvest timing. One surprisingly important practice is the removal of almonds left hanging on trees after harvest. These dried remnants, often called mummies, can shelter insects through winter. Growers shake or strip them from branches and destroy them before the next season. A few forgotten nuts in each tree may seem insignificant, but across thousands of hectares they can sustain a large pest population. The industrial orchard teaches farmers to think at scales much larger than the individual branch. Pollination also becomes industrialized. As almond acreage expands, local wild insects are no longer sufficient to fertilize the enormous number of flowers opening at nearly the same time. Beekeepers transport managed honeybee colonies into orchard districts, placing hives between the rows before bloom. For several weeks, bees move through a landscape suddenly transformed into pale blossoms. Then the colonies are loaded onto trucks and carried elsewhere to pollinate other crops or produce honey. This mobile pollination system allows vast orchards to bear heavily, but it creates dependence. Weather during bloom can prevent bees from flying. Disease, parasites, pesticide exposure, and poor nutrition can weaken colonies. Almond growers must coordinate with beekeepers months in advance, while hive rental becomes a major cost. The crop that began in wild mountain thickets with local insects now depends on an annual migration of managed bees across modern highways. Marketing expands just as dramatically. Grower cooperatives help small producers pool harvests, finance processing plants, negotiate prices, and promote almonds to consumers. Advertising presents them as nutritious snacks, baking ingredients, festive foods, and eventually components of a modern health-conscious diet. New forms appear: sliced almonds, roasted almonds, flavored almonds, almond butter, flour, oil, and beverages marketed as almond milk. Global shipping turns California production into an international trade. Containers loaded with processed almonds leave ports for Europe, India, East Asia, the Middle East, and many other markets. In some regions, they enter ancient culinary traditions that have used almonds for centuries. In others, rising incomes and new food industries create unfamiliar demand. The crop begins moving in enormous volumes along routes no caravan merchant could have imagined. California becomes the dominant global producer, though important almond growing regions remain in Spain, Italy, Iran, Morocco, Turkey, Australia, and elsewhere. Production figures shift from year to year with weather, prices, and new plantings, but the broad pattern is clear. A species domesticated in Asia and refined across Mediterranean civilizations is now heavily concentrated in one engineered agricultural region on the western edge of North America. No single invention creates this dominance. It comes from the combination of machines, water infrastructure, breeding, pollination contracts, processing technology, cooperative organization, finance, advertising, and transport. Remove any one element, and the system becomes less reliable. The modern almond is no longer simply a tree crop. It is the visible kernel of a vast network operating before the first blossom opens and continuing long after the last shipment leaves the port. For thousands of years, people understand the almond's most important difference through taste. A sweet kernel is food. A strongly bitter one is a warning. Farmers preserve sweet trees, remove dangerous seedlings, and pass reliable varieties from one generation to the next without knowing what happens inside the plant. Only in the modern age do scientists begin to uncover the molecular change behind this ancient achievement, revealing that the distance between poison and nourishment can depend on a small alteration in the way a gene is controlled. The search begins with the chemistry already hidden in wild almonds. Bitter kernels contain high concentrations of amygdalin, a cyanogenic compound stored within the seed. Amygdalin itself is not simply a pool of free cyanide waiting inside the nut. The danger emerges when the kernel is crushed, chewed, or otherwise damaged. Enzymes encounter the compound and break it down through a series of reactions, eventually releasing hydrogen cyanide. This molecule interferes with cellular respiration, preventing cells from using oxygen effectively even when oxygen remains present in the blood. The result can be rapid and severe: headache, confusion, weakness, nausea, breathing difficulty, seizures, loss of consciousness, and death may follow a sufficiently large dose. The exact danger varies because bitter almonds differ in amygdalin concentration. Body size affects exposure, and preparation can change how much cyanide is released. This unpredictability explains why there is no universally safe number of bitter almonds. A quantity tolerated on one occasion may be far more dangerous when kernels come from another tree. Sweet commercial almonds contain much less amygdalin, generally at levels too low to create the same risk during normal consumption. For a long time, researchers know the biochemical difference, but not the exact genetic switch responsible for it. The almond genome is large, and the production of cyanogenic compounds involves several stages. Scientists must determine whether sweetness results from a damaged enzyme, a missing chemical precursor, a change in transport within the seed, or some broader interruption in gene regulation. Traditional breeding provides clues. When sweet and bitter trees are crossed, the bitterness of their descendants follows a pattern suggesting that a major genetic region controls the trait. Earlier genetic studies identify a locus associated with sweet kernels, often referred to as the sweet kernel locus. Yet identifying a region on a chromosome is not the same as finding the precise mutation. The relevant stretch may contain many genes, and several of them may appear capable of influencing seed chemistry. Advances in genome sequencing make a closer investigation possible. Researchers compare the DNA of bitter wild almonds, sweet cultivated varieties, and offspring produced through controlled crosses. They examine which genes become active as the kernel develops and where particular chemical compounds accumulate. Gradually, the search narrows toward a regulatory gene involved in controlling the early steps of amygdalin production. The crucial change does not simply destroy the almond's entire chemical machinery. Instead, it alters a transcription factor, a protein that helps switch other genes on or off. In bitter almonds, this regulator activates genes needed to begin the pathway that produces amygdalin in the developing seed. In sweet almonds, a mutation interferes with that regulatory function. The necessary biosynthetic genes are not activated normally in the kernel, so far less amygdalin accumulates. This is an important distinction. The sweet almond does not become edible because humans remove every gene connected with cyanide chemistry. A change higher in the control system reduces the activity of several downstream processes. It is like disabling a set of machines by preventing the main switch from being turned on rather than dismantling every machine individually. A relatively small inherited difference produces a dramatic effect on flavor, toxicity, and the plant's relationship with humans. The discovery confirms something ancient growers had already demonstrated through practice: bitterness is heritable. When they chose seeds from mild trees or copied sweet branches by grafting, they were selecting a genetic trait even though they described it only through taste and experience. Modern science identifies the mechanism, but the experiment began thousands of years earlier in the hands of people cracking shells beside fires and orchards. The finding also helps explain why almond domestication may have moved quickly once the right mutation appeared. Many domesticated traits require the accumulation of several genetic changes. Almond sweetness, by contrast, can be strongly influenced by one major regulatory mutation. Once humans encounter a tree carrying that change, intense selection can rapidly increase its descendants. Every grower prefers the sweet type, while bitter seedlings are rejected. A mutation rare and disadvantaged in the wild becomes dominant within cultivated populations. Yet the story is not entirely simple. Other genes can influence the final amount of amygdalin, and environmental conditions may affect chemical concentrations. Some almonds are intensely bitter, others only mildly so, and sweetness exists along a spectrum rather than as an absolute division. Researchers continue investigating how different varieties regulate cyanogenic compounds and how genetic background modifies the major sweetness trait. No single explanation fully accounts for every variation observed in living trees. Hybridization adds another complication. Cultivated sweet almonds can exchange pollen with bitter relatives or unmanaged seedlings. Depending on the genetic combination, later generations may produce bitter kernels again. Modern orchards avoid much of this uncertainty by propagating named varieties through grafting, which creates genetically consistent trees. Seed-grown almonds remain unpredictable, preserving the ancient possibility that a harmless-looking tree may return to the chemistry of its ancestors. Genetic research also offers practical tools for breeding. Traditionally, a breeder must plant a seedling and wait several years for it to flower and produce kernels before learning whether the offspring is sweet. Molecular markers associated with the sweetness gene allow potentially bitter seedlings to be identified much earlier, sometimes while they are still small plants. This saves land, water, labor, and time. Breeders can focus on individuals carrying the desired form while selecting for other traits such as late flowering, self-fertility, disease resistance, shell quality, and drought tolerance. Self-fertility has become especially valuable. Many traditional almonds require pollen from another compatible variety, making orchards dependent on precise bloom overlap and heavy insect activity. Newer self-compatible cultivars can fertilize themselves more successfully, though bees may still improve yield. Combining self-fertility with sweet kernels and later flowering reduces several risks at once. Genetics allows breeders to assemble traits that ancient farmers could only pursue through decades of trial. The decoding of bitterness also brings renewed attention to claims surrounding amygdalin as an alternative cancer treatment. Substances marketed under names such as letriol, or sometimes inaccurately called vitamin B17, have been promoted as anti-cancer remedies, often using apricot kernels or other cyanogenic seeds. Mainstream medical evidence does not support these claims, and ingestion can cause cyanide poisoning. The appeal rests partly on the idea that a natural compound hidden in seeds must possess a selective medicinal power, but natural origin does not guarantee safety or effectiveness. The almond's own history demonstrates the opposite lesson. Humans do not value the crop because its toxin heals them. They spend millennia selecting almonds in which the toxin is suppressed. Sweetness is not merely a preference for pleasant flavor. It is the visible sign of detoxification through domestication. There is still something extraordinary in the final genetic explanation. The ancient transformation does not require humans to invent a new chemical pathway. Nature provides the mutation. Human attention determines its fate. A wild sweet almond might once have been an evolutionary failure, its undefended seed quickly eaten and its lineage extinguished. People recognize it as valuable, protect it, copy it, and carry it across continents. The mutation survives because humans make a place for it. Modern sequencing gives that invisible turning point a molecular identity. Beneath every sweet almond lies a disrupted genetic command, a message that no longer tells the developing kernel to fill itself with bitterness. The orchard, the medieval kitchen, the merchant caravan, and the modern processing plant all depend on that silence. What ancient farmers learned with their tongues, science can now read in DNA. The modern almond stands at the far end of an extraordinary human experiment. A bitter seed, once protected by poison, now appears in lunchboxes, bakeries, protein bars, festive sweets, restaurant kitchens, cosmetic oils, and cartons of plant-based drink. It is sold as a symbol of health, convenience, and clean nourishment. Yet the polished kernel conceals a more complicated inheritance. The almond's success has created new dependencies, and the very systems that made it abundant now expose it to risks no wild tree on a mountain slope ever faced. Nutritionally, the appeal is understandable. Almonds provide substantial amounts of unsaturated fat, protein, fiber, vitamin E, magnesium, and other micronutrients. Their dense energy once sustained travelers crossing deserts and sailors moving between ports. Today the same density makes them useful as compact snacks. Ground almonds become flour for people avoiding wheat. Almond butter replaces other spreads. Almond milk offers a non-dairy option. Though its nutritional content varies greatly depending on processing and fortification, the nut's reputation has grown through a mixture of genuine nutritional value, changing dietary fashions, and highly effective marketing. But no food exists outside its production system. The modern almond orchard is a permanent biological investment. Unlike a field of annual grain, it cannot simply be left unplanted during a dry year. Trees must remain alive through seasons of low prices, heat waves, water restrictions, and drought. A grower who withholds too much water risks not only the current harvest, but the health of the orchard for years to come. This makes almond production particularly sensitive to long periods of water scarcity. The tension is sharpest in California, where vast orchards depend on irrigation drawn from rivers, reservoirs, canals, and underground aquifers. Almonds are often singled out in public arguments about agricultural water use because the crop occupies a large area and produces a high-value export. Yet the picture is more complicated than a simple accusation against one tree. Many crops require irrigation in California's dry interior. Cities, industries, ecosystems, and farms all compete for limited supplies. Water use also varies with soil, climate, orchard age, irrigation technology, and expected yield. No single explanation fully accounts for the region's water crisis. Still, the physical demand cannot be dismissed. A commercial orchard transforms stored water into kernels, hulls, shells, leaves, and wood. During severe drought, farmers may pump groundwater faster than rainfall and mountain runoff can replace it. Wells deepen. Land can subside as underground sediments compact. Smaller farms and rural communities may lose access to drinking water, while larger operations continue pumping from greater depths. The almond is not solely responsible for these problems, but its expansion becomes part of a landscape pushed beyond older limits. Growers have responded with more efficient irrigation. Drip lines and micro-sprinklers deliver water close to the roots rather than flooding entire fields. Soil sensors, weather data, and measurements of tree stress help determine when irrigation is necessary. These methods can reduce waste and improve yield per unit of water, yet efficiency contains a hidden contradiction. When farmers save water on each hectare but plant more hectares, total consumption may remain high or even increase. A more efficient orchard is not automatically a smaller burden on the watershed. Climate change adds another layer of uncertainty. Almond trees require winter chill to complete dormancy, but they also flower early enough to risk frost. Warmer winters can reduce the chilling needed by some varieties, while unpredictable spring weather may expose blossoms to sudden cold, wind, or heavy rain. Extreme summer heat can stress trees and workers alike. Droughts may become more severe, and intense storms may not refill aquifers as effectively as slow seasonal precipitation. The crop's ideal climate is not simply becoming warmer, it is becoming less predictable. Breeders now search for varieties that flower later, require less winter chill, tolerate heat, resist disease, and use water more efficiently. Self-fertile cultivars may reduce the need for multiple pollinizer varieties and make orchards more reliable during poor bee activity. Rootstocks are selected for salinity tolerance, soil conditions, and resistance to pests. These efforts repeat the ancient pattern of almond history variation appears, humans choose, and the tree changes. The difference is that selection now races against environmental change occurring across entire agricultural regions. Pollination remains one of the most visible dependencies. For a few weeks each year, almond orchards become one of the largest managed pollination events on Earth. Billions of blossoms open across California, and enormous numbers of honeybee colonies are transported into the region. The spectacle is beautiful from a distance, rows of pale flowers beneath a clear sky, but it places bees inside an intense and temporary food landscape. During bloom, there is abundance. Before and after it, orchard floors may offer little variety. Honeybees face multiple pressures, including parasitic mites, viral diseases, pesticide exposure, transport stress, and poor nutrition. Almond pollination does not cause all of these problems, but the industry depends on colonies already carrying the burdens of modern beekeeping. Growers and beekeepers increasingly experiment with planting wildflowers and cover crops between orchard rows, reducing harmful pesticide exposure during bloom and supporting native pollinators. Such changes recognize that an orchard is not merely a collection of trees, it is an ecosystem, even when heavily managed. Biodiversity presents a wider concern. Large single-crop landscapes simplify habitats that once contained grasslands, wetlands, woodland edges, and mixed farms. Uniform orchards make management efficient, but they also allow pests and diseases to move easily between genetically similar trees. In response, growers rely on sanitation, monitoring, chemical controls, beneficial insects, and improved varieties. The struggle resembles the almond's earliest history in reverse. Humans once protected a vulnerable sweet mutation from the wild. Now they must protect millions of its descendants from the ecological consequences of their own success. The global market adds economic fragility. Almond trees continue producing whether prices are high or low. When supply exceeds demand, growers cannot quickly reduce production without abandoning trees that took years to establish. Trade disputes, shipping disruptions, changing consumer preferences, and crop failures in other countries can all shift prices. A nut marketed as timeless natural food is tied to currency movements, container availability, labor costs, port schedules, and political decisions. Beyond California, growers in Spain, Morocco, Iran, Turkey, Australia, and other regions face their own versions of these pressures. Some depend on rainfall and accept lower, less predictable yields. Others expand irrigated production. Traditional orchards may contain older local varieties well adapted to difficult environments, but they can struggle to compete with intensive systems producing uniform kernels at enormous scale. When old orchards disappear, genetic diversity may disappear with them, including traits that future breeders could need. Preserving that diversity has become a quiet form of insurance. Seed collections, research orchards, and living repositories maintain wild relatives and traditional varieties. Bitter almonds, once rejected as dangerous, remain scientifically valuable because they carry genes for toughness, disease resistance, flowering time, and environmental adaptation. The poisonous ancestors are not simply primitive mistakes left behind by progress. They are reservoirs of possibilities. This returns the almond to its original contradiction. Human beings succeed by weakening the seed's defense, but that success makes the crop dependent on continued protection. They spread sweetness across the world, then build irrigation systems, pollination networks, breeding programs, processing plants, and trade routes to sustain it. The almond becomes more abundant than its bitter ancestors could ever have been, yet less capable of existing outside the human world that favors it. The legacy is therefore neither a simple triumph nor a warning against cultivation. It is a record of partnership. Humans notice a rare mutation and give it an evolutionary advantage. In return, the tree provides food, oil, medicine, income, ceremony, and flavor across thousands of years. Both partners are changed. The almond loses much of its poison. Human landscapes gain orchards that flower before spring has fully arrived. Every sweet kernel still carries the result of that ancient gamble. Its mild taste is a genetic silence where bitterness once spoke. Its shell contains the memory of mountain drought, early gatherers, patient farmers, caravan roads, monastery kitchens, imperial gardens, migrant labor, mechanical harvesters, and bees moved across a continent. The almond appears small enough to hold between two fingers, yet its history stretches across civilizations. The question now is whether the next stage of that history can be managed with the same patience that began it. The early cultivators did not force the almond into usefulness overnight. They observed, selected, waited, and adapted. Modern agriculture possesses far greater power, but power does not remove the need for restraint. Water, pollinators, soil, climate, and genetic diversity cannot be treated as invisible machinery. They are the living conditions beneath every harvest. The tamed nut survives because people learn to listen to difference bitter and sweet, failing and productive, fragile and enduring. Its future may depend on learning that lesson again, not only within the seed, but across the entire landscape that allows the tree to bloom. And when the harvest is over, the orchard grows quiet, the machines leave first, dust settles across the empty rows, and the branches stand lighter beneath the fading summer sky. Months pass, leaves yellow and fall. The trees enter dormancy, holding their next season inside wood that appears almost lifeless. Then, before the landscape seems ready, buds begin to open. Pale flowers return to the bare branches, just as they once returned on distant mountain slopes before there were orchards, cities, ships, or written histories. Bees enter the rows. Cold air gathers in the low ground. A farmer watches the forecast, knowing that one night of frost may undo months of preparation. The old uncertainty remains. For a few mornings, the orchard seems suspended between winter and spring. Petals gather along irrigation lines and in the impressions left by tires. The air carries a faint sweetness, and beneath the ground the roots continue their slow work in darkness. Nothing in the scene reveals the caravans, empires, laboratories, and oceans behind it. History has folded itself into an ordinary flowering, so complete that the ancient danger is almost impossible to imagine. Inside each flower is the possibility of a fruit. Inside each fruit, a shell. Inside each shell, a seed whose ancestors defended themselves with poison until human beings found the rare trees that did not. That discovery was never recorded. It survives only in consequence. Perhaps someone once stood beneath a wild almond at the end of a hungry season, cracked one kernel after another, and found sweetness where bitterness was expected. The tree offered no promise that the trait would return. The person had no language for mutation, inheritance, or cyanogenic chemistry. There was only taste, memory, and the decision to carry the seed. From that small act came orchards that crossed empires and oceans. Yet the almond still belongs partly to the world before cultivation to stone, drought, frost, insects, and uncertain rain. Its history reminds us that domestication is never complete. Nature is not conquered and left behind. It continues inside every crop, waiting in genes, seasons, diseases, and weather. So the almond rests in the hand as both food and evidence, a quiet record of danger transformed, knowledge accumulated and dependence accepted. The bitterness has faded, but the long memory of the wild tree remains, sealed beneath the shell.